Welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, prepare yourself for hours of captivating adventures and enchanting discoveries as we take you into a world where fairy tale fantasy blends seamlessly with the calming sound of rain, perfect for unwinding. Before you drift off, let us know where you're tuning in from and the time in the comments below. If these stories spark your imagination, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind wander freely.
Portrait in the gallery. I had been working at the gallery for nearly a year when I first encountered Samuel's portrait. It was a small, independent gallery tucked away on the outskirts of Santa Fe. Its location seemed almost deliberate, as if the place were trying to remain hidden from the world. The building itself was old, its brickwork covered in patches of ivy, and it had the kind of weathered charm that made it easy to overlook. The gallery's interior matched its exterior, a quiet, dimly lit space filled with various pieces of art. Most of the works were modern, or at least contemporary, but there were occasional pieces that hinted at an older, more classical style. My job was simple enough, organizing the exhibits, cataloging new acquisitions, making sure the space remained presentable. But it was also solitary, which was how I liked it. I had always preferred working alone, and the quiet of the gallery suited me perfectly. The hours were long, often stretching into the night, when the gallery would close to the public and I would be left alone to finish the work I couldn't get to during the day. There was something comforting about the stillness. The silence of the building, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, and the way the shadows would stretch across the floor like dark fingers at dusk. In a strange way, the gallery felt like my own private sanctuary. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, and every now and then I would catch a whiff of the mustiness that seemed to cling to everything. But it wasn't unpleasant. The smell felt like a reminder of the gallery's age, of its history. Even the paintings, which had been here long before I had started working, seemed to carry that same ancient, forgotten quality. The artists whose works were displayed here were a mix of the unknown and the famous. Some had created entire careers with their landscapes, their bold strokes of color, their deep, contemplative portraits. But there was one portrait that stood out among the rest, a painting of a man known simply as Samuel. It was impossible not to notice it. It was larger than the other portraits, occupying a prominent spot on the far wall of the gallery. The frame was dark, polished wood, heavy with age. The man in the portrait was dressed in a simple black suit, his posture formal but not stiff, his face calm, almost serene. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for any other classical portrait from the late 1800s, the kind you see in old museums or estates. But there was something about Samuel's eyes. They weren't like the eyes of the other portraits. His gaze was different. It wasn't passive. It was intense, almost too alive. It was as if his eyes were watching me, following me wherever I went in the room. The other paintings in the gallery were lifeless, passive, even. Their subjects might stare out at the viewer, but they were empty. Their eyes were dull, fixed, as if frozen in time. But Samuel's portrait, his eyes had a quality that unsettled me. They weren't just watching, they were aware, as if they knew something I didn't. It was a feeling I couldn't shake every time I passed by. There were whispers among the staff about the portrait, of course. It was one of those pieces you'd hear strange stories about. Samuel had vanished years ago. Some said he had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No one knew exactly what happened to him. There were rumors, of course, the kind that seemed to gather around every old mystery. Some said he'd been involved in some shady dealings, while others claimed that he had simply vanished, never to be seen again. But it wasn't just the rumors that gave me an uneasy feeling. It was the way the portrait seemed to live in a way the other paintings didn't. It was as if Samuel was there with you in the room, not just a static image, but a presence. And that presence was heavy. It felt like something waiting, something watching. Samuel's portrait was strange in ways that defied logic. There was something unsettlingly real about it, something that made me feel as though I were standing in front of an actual person rather than just a painted canvas. The lighting in the gallery never seemed to fall on him quite right, always casting his features in an eerie shadow. And the longer I stared at him, the more I began to feel that he was studying me. The details in the portrait were striking. Samuel's face was finely painted, his features sharp and defined, his expression calm but with a hint of something underneath, something I couldn't quite place. He had high cheekbones, dark, almost too perfect eyebrows, and lips that were slightly pursed, as though he were on the verge of saying something. The suit he wore looked almost too modern for the time period the painting suggested, though it could have been simply the artist's choice to make him look timeless. His eyes, those eyes, were what I couldn't forget. They weren't just painted eyes, they looked real, like they could blink at any moment, like they could follow you around the room if you moved too quickly. The more I looked, the more I felt like he was seeing through me, judging me, and there was something about the gaze that unnerved me. I could never shake the feeling that his eyes were filled with some hidden knowledge, a secret that he wanted to share, but never would. And though the portrait was just a painting, it had a strange aura about it. There was an intensity in those eyes that seemed to pull at me, making it difficult to pull my gaze away. There was also something about the background of the portrait. It wasn't quite clear, not like the backgrounds in the other paintings. It wasn't a landscape or a familiar room. It was dark and vague, as if Samuel were floating in a void, separated from the world. It made him feel more isolated, more distant, and yet at the same time, more real, like he was trapped between two worlds, this one and another one that I couldn't quite touch. One evening, after everyone had left the gallery and I was alone, I stood in front of the painting, just staring. There was something about it that drew me in, a pull I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was the stillness of the gallery, the quiet that stretched on endlessly around me. But that night, something felt different. The air seemed thicker, colder. The lights buzzed overhead, their hum filling the otherwise silent room. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stared at the portrait. That was when I first noticed it. It wasn't anything extreme, nothing that would make anyone believe the painting had come to life. But as I looked at Samuel's face, I noticed the slightest shift in his expression. His lips, which had once been pressed together in a calm, serene manner, now seemed to show a subtle movement, just a hint of a frown, almost imperceptible. The eyes, they didn't just stare anymore, they shifted, the pupils twitching ever so slightly. It could have been a trick of the light, but I wasn't sure. My heart began to race, and I took a step back from the portrait. My mind told me it was just a trick of my tired eyes, nothing more. I shook my head, forcing myself to look away, but the feeling lingered. There was something off about it. I wasn't imagining the change, I knew I wasn't. It was as if the painting had somehow responded to me, shifting slightly, pulling me into its orbit. And I couldn't stop looking. For the rest of the night, I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, crawling under my skin. I couldn't explain it, but as I left the gallery and locked the door behind me, I felt as if I were being watched by something that wasn't quite human, something that lived in the depths of the painting itself. I tried to forget about it. After all, it was just a painting, right? But the unease, the feeling of being observed, stayed with me long after I left the gallery that night. I never could have guessed that the portrait's unsettling behavior was just the beginning. The next few days passed without incident, but the unease I felt around Samuel's portrait never fully left me. In fact, it seemed to grow. Every time I passed by it, I couldn't help but glance at his face, half expecting to see it change again. But nothing happened. At least, nothing obvious. Then, on the third evening, something caught my eye as I was tidying up the room. I had been dusting a nearby table when I happened to look toward the portrait. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another one of those moments when you feel like someone's looking at you, even though you know they're not. But then I noticed that Samuel's eyes weren't where they used to be. The angle had shifted ever so slightly. I blinked, leaned in closer, and examined the painting more carefully. His gaze wasn't just following me anymore. It was sharper, more focused. It was as if his eyes were deliberately locked onto me. The pupils, once so dark and unyielding, had a glint to them now, an intensity that felt alive. I almost felt like I could see emotion behind those eyes, recognition, perhaps, or even curiosity. My heart began to beat faster, and a chill crept down my spine. This wasn't normal. I had seen enough portraits in my time to know that eyes in paintings don't shift like that, not on their own. And yet here I was, standing before a painting that seemed to defy every rule I knew about art. I stepped back, trying to shake the discomfort off. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Perhaps I was just too tired, too on edge from the solitude of the job. But as I turned to leave the room, I couldn't help but feel the weight of those eyes still on me. The feeling lingered long after I had walked away. It wasn't until the following night that things took a darker turn. The days that followed were a blur of routine and discomfort. I tried to push the strange occurrence from my mind, but Samuel's portrait seemed to haunt me more with each passing hour. The gallery was mostly quiet during the day, with only a few visitors coming in sporadically. But the nights were different. They were when I felt it. The silence in the gallery deepened, and the shadows grew long, stretching into corners where they didn't belong. I found myself drawn back to the portrait, unable to resist the pull it had on me. I'd tell myself I was just checking the room, ensuring everything was in order, but in truth, I went to see if the eyes would move again. The unsettling feeling was growing inside me, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. One evening, I found myself standing in front of the painting again, studying the man's face with an almost obsessive intensity. There was something wrong about the way Samuel's expression seemed to shift. It wasn't like the slight changes I had noticed before. This was more pronounced, more unsettling. His lips, once neutral, were now drawn tight in what could almost be called a frown. His eyes had lost their initial curiosity. Instead, they seemed darker, more sorrowful. There was a depth to them now, as if a great tragedy had unfolded in the time since I last saw him. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. Maybe I was just seeing what I wanted to see, overanalyzing the painting. Maybe the lighting was playing tricks on me. But as I looked into those eyes, I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something being communicated. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. The air felt colder, heavier. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they hovered near the surface of the painting. I don't know why I did it. I wasn't touching it, not yet, but my mind was racing. Was it possible that the painting was somehow alive? That it could convey emotions, thoughts, even warnings? My logical side screamed at me to stop, to walk away, but something else, something deeper, was compelling me to stay. I couldn't look away. A sudden draft of air swept through the room, chilling me to the bone. It seemed to come from nowhere, as if the room itself were sighing. The temperature dropped, and I instinctively pulled my coat tighter around me, my skin prickling. That's why I saw it. In the stillness of the gallery, Samuel's expression shifted again. This time, the change was subtle, but undeniable. The faintest curve of his lips, almost a grimace, formed, and his eyes narrowed slightly, the pupils becoming sharper. I stepped back, my heart racing. The air around me felt thicker, as if the room itself were pressing in on me. I wasn't imagining this. I knew I wasn't. My mind raced as I backed away from the portrait. Was it possible that the painting was trying to communicate with me? Or was this something worse, a sign of something dark, something malevolent hidden within the gallery walls? The thoughts swirled in my mind as I left the gallery for the night, locking the door behind me. But as I walked down the empty street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That someone, or something, was watching me. And I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The next day passed uneventfully, but the sense of unease that clung to me from the night before didn't dissipate. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger. I found myself dreading the evening, knowing I would have to return to the gallery and face the portrait once again. Each time I passed by it, I tried to act normal, but the portrait seemed to pull my attention, forcing me to look at it more closely. That night, I couldn't resist any longer. After the gallery had closed and the building fell into its usual silence, I found myself standing in front of Samuel's portrait once again. The gallery felt colder tonight, even though the heater had been on. The low hum of the lights above did little to break the thick, heavy air. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off, that the walls themselves were watching me. As I stared at the painting, I could feel my pulse quicken. The light in the room flickered, casting strange shadows across Samuel's face. For a brief moment, I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the change in the portrait was undeniable. His lips, those lips that had once been so subtle in their expression, were now unmistakably drawn in a hard, thin line. They looked like they were trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes, too, had changed. No longer soft or sorrowful, they were now filled with something darker, something more intense, almost as if they were warning me or trying to tell me something urgent. I couldn't breathe. My body froze as I stood there, caught in the gaze of the painted figure. It was as if time had stopped, as if the entire room had turned into a still, silent trap, with only the beating of my own heart to remind me that I was still alive. Suddenly, the quiet was broken. A sound, a faint scratching, came from somewhere near the painting. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder as I strained to listen. My breath caught in my throat. The sound seemed to come from the frame, from behind the canvas itself. As if something was trying to get out, something that had been trapped there for far too long. I stepped closer to the painting, my hand reaching out instinctively. My fingertips brushed against the frame, and in that moment, I felt a jolt, a shock of energy that ran through me, from my hand to my chest. It was as if the painting had reached out to me, pulling me closer, urging me to look deeper. And then it happened. I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. Samuel's face, his eyes, shifted again. This time, they didn't just narrow or widen. The expression on his face twisted, contorted, as though some unseen force was manipulating it. His mouth opened slightly, and his eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. They moved with me, not in a natural way, but with a malevolent energy that sent a cold shiver down my spine. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something flash in his eyes, recognition. a knowing, like he was looking straight at me, not just as a viewer of his portrait, but as someone who had seen too much. I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. I was barely aware of the sudden surge of panic that hit me, overtaking my thoughts. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the portrait, yet I couldn't stand to be in its presence any longer. It was as though the painting was alive, that it was no longer just a work of art, but a trapped soul, trying to communicate, trying to break free. But there was no way to understand what it was saying. And I knew, deep down, that I wasn't meant to. The following week, the unease I had felt before was replaced with a constant, gnawing dread. I found myself dreading the evening more and more, knowing I would have to return to the gallery. But even then, I couldn't stop myself. Something inside me pulled me back. Each night, I would visit the portrait, only to leave in a state of heightened fear and confusion. The changes in the painting were becoming more frequent, more noticeable. It wasn't just the expression on Samuel's face anymore, it was everything. The shading seemed to shift subtly, like the lighting in the room was changing, even though it remained the same. The air around the portrait felt heavier, as if it was absorbing the atmosphere of the gallery, pulling everything closer to it. The silence became suffocating, and every creak of the old wooden floors echoed in my mind like a warning. One night, I stood in front of the painting longer than usual. I had been trying to ignore it, trying to get used to its strange presence, but tonight it seemed impossible. The dim light from the chandelier above cast flickering shadows across the gallery, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was moving in closer, as though the room was alive. Then I saw it again. This time, the change was more pronounced. Samuel's eyes had shifted once more, but this time they were no longer just following me. They had narrowed into a sharp, focused gaze, as if they were waiting. His lips were now parted in a slight, unsettling smile, the kind of smile you give when you know something the other person doesn't. It was as though the man in the portrait was aware of me, aware of my every movement. I felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine. A strange chill filled the room, even though the air conditioning was off, and the gallery had always been warm at this time of year. I tried to step away, but I felt trapped. The painting seemed to be pulling me in, as if it had a gravity of its own. I couldn't look away. My feet were rooted to the floor, and despite myself, I found my gaze glued to the painted face of Samuel. The painting was alive. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it. I wasn't going to let this affect me. I wasn't going to let my imagination run wild. But the more I stared, the more I saw. The smile on Samuel's face deepened, becoming more sinister. His eyes, too, they weren't just eyes anymore. They were windows to something else, something dark, something ancient. A whisper seemed to float in the air around me, faint but undeniable. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but then I realized that the whispering sound was coming from the portrait itself. It wasn't audible in a way that made sense. No one else would hear it, I knew that. But I could hear it, clear as day. The voice wasn't speaking words, it was more like a sensation, a presence, filling the space with an unshakable feeling of urgency. The longer I stood there, the more intense the presence became. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, a mist that didn't belong in a well-heated building. The whispers grew louder in my mind, urging me closer to the portrait, urging me to understand, to see. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just Samuel's face I had been looking at. It was his soul, his spirit. It was trapped there, screaming for help. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. My eyes never left the portrait, and Samuel's face seemed to be following me, watching my every move. For a split second, I thought I saw his lips move. Not just in the smile, but as if he was speaking, as if he was trying to tell me something. But I couldn't hear the words. I couldn't understand. And that's why I made a decision. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to understand what was happening to that portrait, what was happening to me. I had been so caught up in the growing unease, the chilling changes in the painting, that I hadn't stopped to think about what all of this meant. I knew I couldn't just keep coming back night after night without trying to uncover the truth. Something in that portrait was trying to communicate with me, trying to warn me, maybe. Or worse, use me. So, the next evening, after the gallery had closed, I decided to research the painting. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I had to do something. I headed straight to the office in the back of the gallery, where the records of the artwork were kept. The dusty shelves were lined with old catalogs, each one more ancient than the last. I pulled out the binder labeled Recent Acquisitions and began flipping through the pages. It didn't take long before I found the painting. The entry was short and simple. Portrait of Samuel Hargrove, oil on canvas, circa 1890. Unknown artist. Donated by estate of deceased. There was no other information, no mention of why the portrait had been donated, no mention of Samuel's life or death. Just that brief, curt statement. But something in that entry caught my attention, donated by estate of deceased. I had always assumed Samuel was just some obscure figure, some forgotten face. But now, I was starting to think that he wasn't just a random subject. There had to be more to his story, something that the gallery didn't want to reveal. I began searching deeper into the archives, going through old newspapers and historical records, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain why Samuel's portrait had such a strange effect on me. But as I went through page after page, one name kept resurfacing, Samuel Hargrove. It seemed that Samuel had been a well-known figure in New Mexico during the late 1800s. He had been a local businessman, wealthy, respected, and then, mysteriously, he had vanished without a trace. According to the old records, no one knew what had happened to him. There were no reports of foul play, no signs of struggle, no body ever found. It was as if Samuel Hargrove had just disappeared one day, leaving behind a life that didn't seem to have any answers. I continued reading, desperate for a clue. As I scrolled through the dusty pages, one line stood out to me. Rumors circulated that Samuel's disappearance had something to do with an ancient curse, a curse tied to the portrait he had commissioned before his death. That was it. That was the connection. There had to be a connection between Samuel's disappearance and the portrait, something supernatural, something malevolent. The more I read, the more the story seemed to unfold. Samuel had been obsessed with the idea of immortality. He had commissioned the portrait as a way to preserve his soul, or so the rumors claimed. There were whispers that the artist had been involved in occult practices, and that the painting itself might be a vessel, a way to trap someone's spirit, to keep them alive even after death. I was shaken. The idea seemed too fantastical to be true, but as I thought back to the odd changes in the painting, the subtle shifts in Samuel's expression, the whispers I'd heard, it all began to make a horrifying sense. Samuel's spirit was trapped in that portrait. And it was trying to communicate with me, just like it had been trying to communicate with anyone who stood before it. I couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel was trying to reach out to me, to tell me something important. The curse, the portrait, it was real. As the night dragged on, I found myself sitting in the office, the light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. My thoughts raced, my heart pounded in my chest. What was Samuel trying to say? Was he asking for help, or was he warning me? The whispers, the changes in the painting, they were all leading me to this moment. I knew one thing for sure. I had to go back to the portrait. I had to confront him, and find out what he wanted. But deep down, I feared what I might uncover. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had uncovered: Samuel Hargrove, his obsession with immortality, the rumors about the cursed portrait. It all felt like it was spiraling into something I wasn't prepared for. And yet, I couldn't turn away. I couldn't leave it behind. Something had changed within me after that night. The more I learned, the more I was pulled into this web of darkness. I couldn't sleep. My mind was consumed by thoughts of Samuel's portrait and of what might happen if I didn't act on what I had discovered. Each night, I returned to the gallery. The unease that had started as a small twinge in my gut had now become a constant weight on my chest. I could feel the presence of the painting like a living thing, a heavy breath that hung in the air whenever I passed it. I spent hours in the gallery after closing, poring over every piece of information I could find about Samuel. Each document, each article only seemed to deepen the mystery. And the more I dug, the more I realized that Samuel's life was not the only strange part of the story. There were other unsettling details, things I hadn't noticed before. People who had come in contact with the portrait over the years had started to experience strange things, too. Visitors to the gallery reported feeling a sense of unease, a kind of oppressive atmosphere that surrounded the painting. Some even said they had heard whispers when they stood too close to it. It wasn't just me. Others had felt it, too. But what disturbed me the most was a line from one of the older newspaper clippings I found, hidden deep in the archives. It was a small paragraph buried in an article about the mysterious disappearance of Samuel. It read, "A local medium claims that Samuel's spirit is trapped in the portrait, unable to rest. The portrait was said to be the final piece of his search for eternal life, and some believe his soul is still bound to it, desperate to reach those who will listen." That was the key. The portrait wasn't just a static image. It was a prison. Samuel's soul, his very essence, was trapped there, unable to move on. And from what I had experienced, it seemed like the portrait was looking for someone to help. But who? Why me? I had no answers yet, but I was beginning to suspect that the changes I had witnessed in the painting were not random. They were part of something bigger, something I was only beginning to understand. The whispers, the subtle shifts in Samuel's expression, they were all part of a desperate attempt to communicate with me, to warn me. And the more I ignored it, the more I feared the consequences. That night, I stood in front of the portrait again, my heart thudding in my chest. It was late, past midnight, and the gallery was silent, save for the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. The temperature had dropped again, just like it always did when I was near the painting. A shiver ran down my spine. This time, though, it wasn't just fear. It was something else, a compulsion, an undeniable pull towards the portrait. I felt it before I saw it, the change. Something had shifted in the air around me. The whispers were louder now, though still unintelligible. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel them, like a pressure building inside my skull, pushing, pulling. My eyes were locked on Samuel's face. It was as though his painted eyes were watching me, looking through me, seeing something I couldn't. I couldn't tell if it was the shadows playing tricks on me, or if the changes were happening before my eyes. but I could have sworn that his smile was wider now. It wasn't just a slight curl of the lips, it was predatory. It felt wrong. Too wrong. As I stared at the painting, something strange began to happen. The shadows around Samuel seemed to deepen, and his face moved. It was subtle at first, just a small shift of the lips. But then, his eyes weren't just staring at me anymore. They followed me, tracking every step I took as I moved around the room. I froze, my blood running cold. No, I thought. This couldn't be happening. But as I tried to look away, as I tried to break the connection, Samuel's face changed again. This time, the smile wasn't just predatory, it was mocking. He was laughing at me. Laughing because I had walked into his trap. And I had. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The whispers were deafening now, filling my mind, clouding my judgment. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't escape. I was trapped, just like Samuel. And now, I realized with a sinking feeling, it wasn't just his soul that was caught in the portrait. It was mine too. I left the gallery that night in a daze, the images of Samuel's mocking smile seared into my mind. But even as I walked out into the cold New Mexico air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It was as though the portrait's eyes never left me, always lurking in the back of my mind, watching my every move. I had to keep reminding myself that it was just a painting, that I was being irrational. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I tried to continue my work at the gallery as usual, but nothing felt the same. Every time I passed by the portrait, I felt a chill in the air, a sensation that I couldn't explain. The whispers, which I had initially thought were just my imagination, now felt real, as if they were coming from the painting itself. I would hear faint sounds, a barely audible murmur, whenever I walked near it. It was unnerving. Was I losing my mind? Or was the painting truly changing, shifting with some unseen force? I didn't know how much longer I could continue like this. The constant sense of being watched, of never being alone, was starting to take its toll. I found myself growing irritable, snapping at colleagues and friends who had no idea what I was going through. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was closing in on me, tightening its grip the longer I stayed. My sleep was restless, plagued by vivid nightmares. I would dream of the gallery, of standing before the portrait, staring into Samuel's ever-changing eyes. In my dreams, his face would contort, twisting into grotesque expressions, each more terrifying than the last. And always, his lips would curl into that mocking smile, as if he were taunting me for my weakness, for not understanding his true nature. I tried to push through the fear. I told myself that I was just stressed, that the pressure of my research was getting to me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just stress. It was something more sinister, something tied directly to that portrait. Samuel's presence, his spirit, was suffocating me. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to demand my attention. And with each passing day, the changes in the painting grew more pronounced, more alive. It was on the fourth night after my last encounter that I finally broke. I had been standing in front of the portrait, as usual, when I noticed it again. The change. The smile. But this time, it wasn't just a smile, it was a grin. A wide, unnervingly pleased grin that stretched across Samuel's face, almost grotesquely. His eyes seemed to burn with intensity, and the whispers, once faint, were now clear, resonating in my mind as if spoken directly to me. "Help me," they said. I froze, my pulse racing. The words were unmistakable, clear as day. I could hear them in my head, feel them in the pit of my stomach. "Help me." I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me. I wanted to run, to escape from the oppressive force that surrounded me, but I couldn't move. It was as though I were rooted to the spot, unable to escape from the portrait's gaze. I tried to turn away, but it was impossible. Samuel's eyes seemed to pull at me, forcing me to look, to understand. "Help me." The voice echoed again, more desperate this time. And in that moment, I understood. Samuel wasn't just trapped in the painting. He was calling out, not for help, but for someone to join him. His spirit, restless and tormented, needed someone to take his place. Someone to fill the void left behind when he disappeared, someone to be bound to the painting forever. I was the one he was waiting for. I was the one he had chosen. I tried to step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I couldn't. It was as though the painting was pulling me in, drawing me closer, suffocating me with its darkness. My vision blurred, my knees buckling beneath me as I tried to tear myself away. The whispers turned to screams, and I felt the air grow thick and heavy, pressing down on me, trapping me in a cage of invisible force. And then, with a final push of will, I broke free. I turned and ran out of the gallery, the sounds of Samuel's voice ringing in my ears. I slammed the door behind me, gasping for breath as I leaned against the cold stone of the gallery's exterior. The night air felt like a slap against my face, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling of suffocation, of something, or someone, pressing in from all sides. I had to escape. But as I turned to leave, I glanced back one last time at the gallery, and through the window, I saw it, Samuel's face. The smile was gone, replaced by something more sinister, an empty, hollow gaze that seemed to reach out toward me, calling me back into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. The words echoed in my mind relentlessly, "Help me." They felt like they were carved into my brain, over and over, each repetition growing louder, more desperate. I kept seeing Samuel's face in my mind, the way his eyes followed me, the twisted grin that had once mocked me now replaced by an empty, pleading stare. My thoughts spiraled out of control, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was coming for me. The next day, I called in sick to work, though I had no intention of going back to the gallery. I told myself that I was done with it, that I had to get out before it was too late. But as the hours dragged on, my mind kept returning to the portrait. I couldn't stop thinking about Samuel, about the whispers, about what I had seen and heard. I knew that I couldn't escape. The gallery was inescapable, and so was the painting. I had learned enough about the portrait to realize that it wasn't just a piece of art. It was a prison, a trap designed to ensnare those who dared to come too close. And now, I was in its grip, whether I liked it or not. I couldn't escape it, couldn't leave it behind. Something inside me had shifted that night, something deep and irreversible. That evening, I made a decision. I would go back to the gallery. But this time, I wouldn't run. I wouldn't let myself be consumed by fear. If I was going to be trapped by Samuel's spirit, then I would face him head on. I needed to understand what was happening, what the portrait wanted, and why it had chosen me. I had to confront the nightmare. As I stood outside the gallery once more, the air seemed colder, thicker. The city around me felt distant, muted, as though everything was holding its breath. I took a deep, shaky breath and stepped through the front door. The gallery was empty, just as it had been countless times before. The silence was suffocating, pressing on me, but I pushed forward, determined to face what awaited me. The dim, flickering lights cast long shadows across the room, and as I walked down the corridor, my gaze was drawn once more to the portrait. I stopped in front of it, my heart pounding. The air felt charged, alive with some unseen energy. I could sense Samuel's presence now, more powerful than ever. His eyes were watching me, waiting. His face, though still the same, seemed more vivid now, more real than it had ever been before. The shadows around him seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing, alive with a dark, consuming force. I reached out a hand, almost involuntarily, as if drawn by a magnetic pull. But as my fingers neared the painting, a surge of cold flooded through me, and I pulled my hand back, gasping for air. The whispers started again, louder this time, and this time they weren't just words. They were thoughts, swirling around my head, fighting for dominance. You should have never come back. It's too late for you. Join me. The voice was Samuel's, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. There was something other in it, something ancient and dark, like the very essence of the portrait was speaking to me. The air was thick with it now, a dense, suffocating presence that made it difficult to breathe, to think. I stepped closer, my mind racing. This wasn't just about a curse, it was a warning. A warning that I hadn't understood before. Samuel wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't pleading for help. He was calling me, and everyone else who had fallen under his spell, to join him. To become part of the portrait, to become part of the story that it held forever. As I stood there, staring into the painting, I saw something new. The edges of Samuel's face seemed to warp, his features distorting and twisting, like the fabric of the painting was coming undone. I saw his eyes shift, no longer locked on mine, but moving. His pupils widened, and for a split second, it was as if he was staring into the depths of my soul, trying to pull me in. I took a step back, but my feet felt like they were stuck in place. The painting was pulling me toward it. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a magnetic force that seemed to draw my very essence toward the canvas. My vision blurred, and I stumbled, grabbing onto the nearest display case for support. The whispers reached a fever pitch, becoming unintelligible, overwhelming. It felt as though the walls of the gallery were closing in around me. The temperature plummeted, and I shivered uncontrollably. I needed to leave. I needed to run. But as I turned to flee, I realized I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, my body unwilling to obey. And then, in that moment, I understood. The portrait had already claimed me. The moment I realized I couldn't move, I felt it, the pull. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a pressure on my chest as if the painting was alive, breathing, pushing against me from all sides. Samuel's eyes were fixed on me, and the longer I stared into them, the more it felt like I was losing myself in the depths of that image. His smile, if it could even be called that, was wide, unnaturally wide, as if it were forcing itself to stretch across his face, mocking my helplessness. Was I already becoming a part of it? The thought clawed at my mind. It was as if the room itself was collapsing around me, the walls pressing inward, and the darkness from the portrait reaching out to claim me. I could feel it, the weight of the curse, the truth that had slowly dawned on me over the past few days. The portrait wasn't just a painting, it was a prison. And I was its next prisoner. For the first time since I had stepped foot into the gallery, I realized that there was no escape. Samuel's face was now a grotesque reflection of my own fear, each wrinkle and line on his face now exaggerated, as though they were slowly becoming part of my own expression. The whispers didn't stop, growing more frenzied, more desperate, as if they were calling out for me to understand, to accept it. "You're mine now," the voice said. It wasn't Samuel's voice anymore. It was something darker, older, twisted. It seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, from the painting itself, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. But it didn't matter. The voice was in my head, and it wasn't going away. I closed my eyes, desperate to escape the pull of the portrait, but when I opened them again, I realized that I hadn't moved. I was still standing there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from Samuel's face. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my hands trembling as I fought the overwhelming sense of inevitability that was taking root in my mind. It was impossible to deny it any longer. This is happening. This is real. My chest tightened. I had read about curses, about haunted objects, but I had never truly believed in them, not until now. It wasn't just the painting itself, it was the history behind it. The stories I had uncovered during my research about Samuel, the man who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind nothing but his image on that canvas. The more I had learned about him, the more I realized that his disappearance wasn't just a random event. It had been part of a much darker pattern. But this was beyond anything I had imagined. This was no longer about a missing person. This was a curse, a dark force bound to the painting, and it had claimed me as its next victim. I could feel it in my bones, the slow creeping realization that I was already a part of the painting. I had been chosen, marked, to become one of its changing faces, just like Samuel had before me. I reached up to touch my face, as if trying to hold onto my identity, but it was no use. The more I tried to grasp onto something familiar, the more I felt like I was losing myself. My reflection in the glass was warped, distorting as though the lines between me and the portrait were beginning to blur. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now, echoing in my ears. They were no longer words, they were images, flashes of Samuel's face, twisting and contorting, his eyes wide and desperate. "Help me," the whispers begged. "Join me." And the more I looked, the more I saw myself in his expression. I stepped back, my mind spinning. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The pull from the portrait was like a magnetic force, drawing me in, drawing my very essence closer, until it felt like I was part of the painting. My hands shook as I clutched at the air, desperate to break free, but it was no use. The room was closing in around me, the walls pressing against my chest, and I knew, deep down, that there was only one way out. I had to confront it. I had to face the curse head on. I closed my eyes and drew in a shaky breath. The air was thick with the scent of something old, something decayed. I could feel the presence of the portrait even with my eyes closed, like a dark cloud hovering just above me. I wasn't sure how much longer I could resist, but I knew that if I didn't do something now, I would be lost. It wasn't enough to just see the curse. I had to understand it. I had to know what it wanted from me. And so, I opened my eyes again, forcing myself to face Samuel's unblinking stare. And then, for the first time since I had stepped foot in this cursed place, I saw something new in his eyes. Fear. Fear. It was subtle at first, just a flicker behind Samuel's eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible change. But then it deepened, and I saw it clearly. His face, once twisted with a grotesque smile, now held something darker, something raw. Fear. Real fear. His lips trembled, his eyes widened in silent, unspeakable horror, as if he had seen something far worse than his own fate. And then, for a split second, his expression morphed. It was a warning. "Help me," the whispers urged again, this time with even more urgency, more terror. I was no longer the only one who could hear them. I could feel the desperation in the very air around me. Get out before it's too late. Before it claims you. The painting, which had once been a simple portrait, now felt like a living entity, its eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse race. And in those eyes, in that fleeting moment, I understood. Samuel hadn't just disappeared. He hadn't merely been trapped in the painting. He had been consumed by it. And now, it was trying to pull me in too. The thought hit me like a brick. The curse. It wasn't just a portrait, it was the painting itself. It was a portal. A doorway to another realm, where souls were trapped, where they were changed, twisted into something else. Something eternal. I felt a cold sweat break out across my brow, my body shivering with the realization of what was at stake. The whispers grew louder, no longer just words, but screams, cries for help that turned into warnings, filled with despair. "It's too late for you now. You can't leave. You're part of it now. The curse is alive, and it's reaching for you." I took an involuntary step back, the overwhelming weight of it all pressing down on me. But no matter how hard I tried to move, it felt as though my feet were sinking into the floor, as if the gallery itself was holding me in place. I couldn't escape. Not anymore. As the realization sank in, my mind scrambled for answers. I had to find a way out. I had to break the curse. But how? How could I fight something so old, so ancient? That's when I remembered the research I'd done, the stories, the hushed whispers I'd overheard while working at the gallery. There were rumors about the painting's origin. Samuel's disappearance wasn't just the result of some tragic event. It was tied to something far older, something more powerful, a dark force that had followed that portrait wherever it went. It was said that those who became a part of the painting, who were trapped within it, were bound by a curse, one that would draw in new souls, adding them to the growing collection of lost faces. Once you were in, you could never leave. The very nature of the painting twisted your soul, turning you into one of its shifting images, lost forever in the canvas's shifting world. The whispers continued, relentless. "Join us. Become one of us." The voice had no identity. It was nothing and everything all at once. I wanted to scream. I wanted to escape. I wanted to break free from its grasp. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. And that's when I saw it, the shift. In a sickening, slow motion, the portrait began to move, like something out of a nightmare. Samuel's face blurred, his features melting and reforming, twisting into something unrecognizable. But it wasn't just his face, it was mine too. I blinked hard, trying to clear the growing haze in front of my eyes. But when I looked again, my heart stopped. The face staring back at me was no longer just Samuel's. It was mine, melded with his. My expression had twisted into something else entirely, horror, grief, confusion. And I could feel it. It wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just a vision. I was becoming part of it. This is what the curse does, I realized, a cold sweat running down my spine. The moment you stare too long, the moment you let it take hold, it becomes a part of you. The longer you resist, the stronger its hold becomes. You lose yourself piece by piece until there is nothing left of you, until you are just another face, another change on the cursed canvas. My pulse thundered in my ears, and for a moment, I felt like I was drowning. I wanted to tear my eyes away, to look anywhere else, but it was no use. The painting pulled me in. My body fought against the unseen force, but I couldn't move. And then the full weight of it hit me. The portrait had been warning me all along. It wasn't just Samuel trying to escape. It wasn't a cry for help, it was a warning to anyone who dared to approach. The painting wasn't just a haunted relic. It was a predator, feeding off the souls of those who became lost within its frame, claiming them, trapping them in its eternal prison. And now, it was coming for me. The moment I realized the truth, the full weight of it, I felt the room around me shift, almost imperceptibly. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the space itself was tightening, constricting, like the painting was trying to draw everything in. I could feel it, the pull from the canvas, seeping into my very being, pressing against my chest, choking me. The whispers, now louder than ever, filled my mind, their words becoming more distinct, more desperate. Join us. I stumbled backward, struggling to breathe, but it felt like the very air had turned to lead. My chest heaved with the effort to breathe, each inhale shallow, as though the oxygen in the room was being siphoned away. I reached for the nearest chair, desperate for something to steady myself, but it was no use. The walls of the gallery were closing in, the light flickering in the corners of my vision. The whispering, it was growing louder, like an unstoppable tide, crashing against my sanity, pulling me deeper. The edges of the room blurred, the familiar comfort of the gallery I'd worked in for so long dissolving into something alien. The dim overhead lights flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows across the walls. Everything felt wrong. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself completely, I saw something shift in the corner of the gallery. I couldn't explain it at first, but it felt like a presence, something watching me, waiting. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Or so I thought. My eyes were drawn back to the portrait. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't just Samuel's face anymore. It wasn't just an image trapped in time. No, this time, the face moved. It shifted, just barely, but enough to make me question my sanity. His eyes, once cold and lifeless, now followed me, tracking me. There was no mistaking it. It was no longer a painting, a mere representation of a man long gone. It was alive. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. The fear that gripped me wasn't just psychological anymore. It was physical. My whole body shook, my legs refusing to move, as though I was rooted in place. The gallery seemed to warp around me, its once familiar layout distorting, the walls pressing in closer as the portrait seemed to grow larger, its presence expanding. Then the whispers became clearer, sharper, like an urgent plea. You can't leave. You belong to it now. You're part of the painting. I tried to scream, to fight back, but my mouth felt numb, as though the very words were trapped in my throat. The air around me thickened again, and I could hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was walking toward me. I spun around, my breath quickening, but there was no one there. It didn't make sense. The gallery should have been empty. It was after hours. I was alone. But the footsteps, they were real. They were here. And they were getting closer. I turned back to the portrait, and that's when I saw it. The figure standing behind the painting, just out of sight, but not quite hidden. Its outline was faint, a shadow flickering in the periphery, but there was no mistaking it. I could feel the weight of its presence, the malevolent force pressing on me from all sides. It was the curse, alive, and now it was coming for me. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. My vision swam as the shadow behind the portrait grew clearer, more defined, as though something was trying to step out of the canvas itself. I could see it now, a tall figure, indistinct, its face hidden in shadow. But even without seeing its features, I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. I wasn't just witnessing the curse. It was coming for me. The figure was emerging from the painting, reaching out, its form solidifying. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The terror paralyzed me, every fiber of my being urging me to run, to escape. But I was frozen, caught in the gaze of Samuel's eyes, his face now distorted with fear. "It's too late for you," the voice echoed in my mind. The figure behind the portrait was nearly whole now, its form taking shape, and I could feel its energy like a crushing weight. I knew then that it wasn't just the painting I was dealing with. It was the spirit, the entity that had been bound to it for so long. And it wanted me. It needed me. Help me. The whispering, the call of Samuel's face, his agony now my agony. It was as if our fates were intertwined, bound together by this terrible, insatiable force. I had been chosen, and there was no escape. The shadow stepped fully out of the painting, its form towering over me. It was as though the very air was alive with its presence. The walls of the gallery, the space itself, trembled. I could hear the rustle of something alive moving through the gallery. And then, the entity spoke, its voice distant and yet somehow inside my head. "You will be the next face. Your soul will be my own." In that moment, I realized that Samuel wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, my body unwilling to move despite the overwhelming terror pulsing through me. It felt like hours, though I knew it couldn't have been. The gallery had become a distorted version of itself, everything around me pulling inward like a vortex, the walls closing in, warping with each beat of my heart. I could hear my breath, ragged and desperate, but it sounded foreign, out of sync with the panic that surged through me. The figure that had stepped from the painting stood in the center of the room, its form a dark, indistinct silhouette against the dim lighting. The air around it seemed to crackle with energy, its presence drawing the very warmth from the room, leaving an unbearable chill in its wake. I wanted to look away, to turn and run, but my body refused to cooperate. My limbs were heavy, as if shackled by some unseen force. I could feel the eyes of the entity on me, but it wasn't like any gaze I had ever known. There was no malice, no anger in it. Instead, it felt empty, cold. The weight of its gaze pressed down on me, sinking into my very bones, freezing my thoughts, draining me of my will. I tried to fight it, to pull myself out of this stupor, but the harder I fought, the more suffocating the silence became. The whispers in my head, the ones I had been hearing for what seemed like eternity, now swirled into a maddening cacophony. They weren't just voices anymore, they were thoughts. My thoughts. "Help me." The words twisted in my mind, distant but intimate, echoing in the corners of my consciousness. Help who? I thought desperately. The entity? Samuel? Or was it me? The painting. The face. The shifting of the expression. I realized, too late, that I had been part of this all along. This was never just a simple painting. It wasn't merely the work of an artist, it was a trap, an ensnaring of souls. I could feel it now, the threads of fate pulling me into the same abyss from which Samuel had never returned. This curse, this thing, was using the painting to claim its victims one by one, and I was the next. I wanted to scream, to break free from the bonds of fear that held me in place. But the longer I stood there, staring into those lifeless eyes, the more my mind unraveled. It wasn't just the physical presence of the entity that tormented me, it was what it made me feel. The crushing weight of my isolation. The agony of being trapped, unable to break free. The creeping realization that there was no escape. You're trapped. The voice, a low murmur in my mind, felt like it came from inside the very walls of the gallery. I blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the intrusive thoughts, but the more I tried, the more they embedded themselves in my mind. The entity had already planted itself there, its influence spreading like a cancer. There was no denying it. I had already begun to become a part of the painting. The space around me was shrinking. My body felt heavier with each passing second, as though I were sinking into the floor, becoming one with the very earth beneath me. Samuel. I whispered aloud, though the words tasted bitter on my tongue. What had happened to him? Had he succumbed to this fate as well? Had he been slowly eaten by the painting, piece by piece, until he too had vanished from the world? I didn't know. I could only imagine the horrors he had experienced. But now, it didn't matter. I had seen the truth. Samuel's fate was my own. I felt my vision start to blur, the edges of the room darkening. The whispers, they had changed. Now, they weren't just pleas. They were commands. Insistent. Urgent. Look closer. I shook my head, as if that would somehow stop the images from pressing into my mind. But it was futile. The whispers commanded my attention. I turned back to the portrait, my heart racing as the edges of the figure emerged from the shadows. The longer I stared, the more its outlines seemed to take form. The face, Samuel's face, seemed to twist and warp, stretching into a grotesque expression of agony and terror. His mouth moved. At first, it was so faint I couldn't be sure, but then it became unmistakable. Get out. Get out while you still can. It was Samuel's voice, or what had once been Samuel's voice. I felt a chill sweep over me, and my heart skipped a beat. I wanted to run, to flee, but the words held me. I could feel them inside me, now. Get out, the voice urged again, louder this time, but now there was an urgency in it that made my blood run cold. But it was too late. The figure from the portrait was moving. It was coming for me. It was like a tidal wave of fear had washed over me, drying every thought, every impulse. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. My chest was constricting, as though a great weight had settled there, pressing down on my lungs, making every inhale a struggle. The figure, the shadow that had emerged from the painting, was now fully tangible, standing right before me. I couldn't see its face. No, that wasn't quite right. I could see its face, but it wasn't really a face. It was as though its features were constantly shifting, constantly changing, slipping between forms like liquid. One moment, I could make out Samuel's face, twisted in terror, his eyes wide and pleading. The next moment, the face was something else entirely, an older man, withered and cracked, his expression full of deep sorrow. It was like the painting was alive and breathing, shifting through faces and emotions with each beat of my heart. The air felt alive, crackling with an energy I couldn't understand. The walls of the gallery seemed to stretch and bend, the floor rippling beneath me. The gallery I'd spent countless hours in, the gallery that had been my home for so long, was no longer a safe place. It was an endless abyss, a prison from which there was no escape. The whispers returned, louder now, mingling with the strange murmurs of the shifting figure. It was as if they were speaking directly into my mind, their voices blending into one terrible cacophony. "You cannot leave." The voice was clear now, unmistakable. The figure's form rippled again, and suddenly its eyes locked onto mine, Samuel's eyes. There was no mistaking it now. It was him. "You were supposed to help me," Samuel's voice echoed, as if coming from both the figure and the walls themselves. It was a wail of desperation, of endless suffering. "But you didn't listen. You didn't see the warning. Now, you will become part of it." I stumbled back, the cold sweat pouring from my skin, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears, it felt like the walls themselves were shaking with the rhythm of my panic. I tried to turn, to run, to find some escape, but the gallery had become a labyrinth, its once clear halls now stretching into infinity, disorienting and unrecognizable. My mind was spinning, my thoughts racing, trying to make sense of the impossible, trying to understand how it had come to this. The painting, the figure, the curse, it all made sense now. Samuel's disappearance, his being trapped in that frame, was no coincidence. This was no random painting. It had always been alive, feeding on the souls of those who dared to enter its grasp. The curse had been waiting for someone to come close enough, to care enough about the painting to see. And now, I had become its next victim. "You cannot fight it," the voice whispered again, this time deeper, more insistent. "It has already taken you." I could feel it, then. The coldness seeping into my bones, creeping into my blood, a numbness spreading from the tips of my fingers, up my arms, across my chest. My vision blurred, the gallery walls closing in, folding over me, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and in that moment, I understood. It wasn't coming for me as a threat. No, it was coming for me as something far worse. It was claiming me. It was showing me the final warning, the last chance I had to escape, to flee while I still had the ability to do so. But it was already too late. I felt the shift inside me, a pull, an unseen force that was gradually merging me with the painting. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed onto the cold floor, unable to move. I could feel the figure now, pressing against me, its presence merging with mine. The coldness seeped deeper, as though it were turning my very flesh to stone. My hands, once trembling in fear, now felt like they belonged to someone else, like they weren't even my own. The figure's form wavered again, flickering like a distorted mirror. I could hear Samuel's voice once more, desperate and pleading, but now it wasn't just his voice. It was mine too. "Help me." I realized with a horrifying clarity that I was becoming a part of the painting. My identity, my life, my very soul were being consumed. The painting had won. I was being swallowed whole by its dark, insatiable force, just like the countless others before me. And then, just as the last of my strength ebbed away, I saw it, the final face. It wasn't Samuel's. It wasn't mine either. It was both of us, twisted and warped, merged together in agony and suffering, locked forever in the prison of the portrait. My last thought, as I felt myself dissolve into the canvas, was the same as Samuel's. It was too late. And then, there was nothing. The lights flickered in the gallery, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. I had returned to the gallery with the weight of my decision pressing heavily on my shoulders. I had to know the truth. I had to understand what had happened to Samuel and to the others who had vanished. The gallery was no longer just a place of art, it was a cursed domain, a house of horrors that I had somehow found myself trapped in. There had been no going back after that night. After seeing the portrait's face change, after feeling the cold presence that seemed to pulse from the painting, I knew I couldn't leave. I couldn't forget. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was somehow linked to it now. The whispers had returned again, growing louder each night, echoing through the empty halls as if they were reaching out, calling me, pulling me closer to the mystery I had unwillingly stepped into. Tonight was different, though. This wasn't just another night spent in fear or unease. This was the night I had decided to confront it, to face the terror that had been haunting me. It wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about understanding. Understanding the painting, the entity within it, and perhaps understanding myself. I paced the length of the gallery, my footsteps echoing loudly in the vast silence. The rows of paintings, once comforting, now seemed to mock me with their stillness. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, as though the gallery itself were holding its breath. The portrait, the one that had drawn me in, that had ensnared me, was still there, hung on its lonely wall, its presence more oppressive than ever. It seemed to watch me. The eyes in the painting, those haunting, shifting eyes, followed my every move. The face, once so vivid and full of emotion, now seemed distant, as though it were fading. Or perhaps I was fading. Perhaps it was my perception, warped and distorted by the terror that had gripped my mind. I had read the old accounts about the portrait. The rumors. The whispers of the curse, of the artist's madness, of the souls trapped within the frames of the gallery. They said the paintings were alive, feeding off the emotions of those who gazed upon them. But no one had dared stay long enough to discover the truth. But I was different. I had to stay. I had to know. With every step I took toward the portrait, the feeling of coldness intensified. It felt as though the very air had dropped in temperature, the chill settling into my bones. I stood before the painting, my heart pounding in my chest, and I stared into the eyes of the figure. I could almost hear it calling me, its gaze pulling me in, urging me to understand, to see. This was no longer just a painting. It was a doorway, a portal to something far darker than I had ever imagined. I could feel the entity inside the frame, its presence pressing against me like a physical force. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stand it. But I couldn't turn away. Not now. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. You shouldn't have come, they hissed. You can't stop it. No one can. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breath. The room seemed to spin, and when I opened my eyes again, I could have sworn the figure in the painting had changed. It wasn't a small shift like before. It was different. More pronounced. The eyes, Samuel's eyes, were wide, filled with panic, as though they were trying to warn me of something. His mouth moved, but no sound escaped. His features warped again, flickering between his own face and something else, something unrecognizable. The painting was alive. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The entity within the portrait wasn't just trying to contact me, it was demanding that I understand. The curse, the force that had claimed so many before me, was now reaching out, its grip tightening around me, pulling me closer to its dark embrace. I had no choice. I couldn't leave. Not now. I was already too far gone, too deeply entangled in its web. And so, I made my choice. Tonight, I would stay. I would face whatever lay behind the painting's curse. I would unravel the mystery, or I would join the others, trapped forever in the shifting, suffocating darkness of the frame. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound a reminder of the passing time, a cruel countdown that I couldn't escape. The gallery felt more like a prison now. The walls seemed to close in, and the very air was thick with an unnatural heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. There was a coldness that gripped the room, seeping into my bones and settling into the pit of my stomach. It was as if the gallery itself was alive, waiting, watching, its gaze just as suffocating as the one I felt coming from the painting. I could still feel the pull of the portrait, its presence drawing me closer, beckoning me. The whispers, too, hadn't stopped. They filled the air, swirling around me in a chaotic symphony of despair. I couldn't understand the words, but the feeling was unmistakable. I was not alone. I had never been alone in this place. The sound of my breath, shallow and quick, echoed in the vast space. I could feel the weight of the gallery's silence pressing down on me, its suffocating quietness broken only by the faint whispers and my racing heartbeat. I forced myself to step closer to the portrait. The closer I got, the colder it seemed. The chill in the room intensified, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. My skin prickled as if something, was standing just behind me, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I stood in front of the portrait, staring into the shifting face of Samuel. The more I looked, the more the face distorted. It wasn't just changing anymore, it was morphing, becoming something else entirely. The eyes that had once seemed so familiar were now unrecognizable, pools of darkness, empty and hollow. And yet, beneath the surface of those eyes, I could feel something, a presence, waiting to break free. A cold gust of air swept through the room, making me flinch. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the figure's lips move. This time, it wasn't a silent plea. This time, there was a sound, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from both the painting and the walls surrounding me. "You should have listened," the voice said, its tone full of malice. "Now you are mine." I took a step back, my heart racing. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The figure in the painting shifted again, its features becoming more distorted, more terrifying. The face was no longer Samuel's. No, it was something far worse. It was an amalgamation of faces, all twisted and contorted, as though the painting had absorbed the suffering of every soul it had ever claimed. The whispering grew louder, the voices blending into a single, unified cry. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel them, pulling me in, dragging me deeper into the nightmare. The coldness intensified, and I found myself unable to tear my eyes away from the painting. It felt as though the figure in the frame was reaching out, its presence seeping through the canvas, trying to take hold of me, to consume me. The pressure in the room was unbearable now. I could feel the walls pressing in, as though the gallery itself were collapsing around me. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and my chest tightened. I was suffocating. I couldn't move. I could only watch as the face in the portrait continued to shift, each new face more grotesque than the last, a horrifying parade of lost souls. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to escape, to run far from the painting, from the gallery, from the overwhelming sense of doom that hung in the air. But my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. My body refused to obey, my mind clouded with a growing sense of dread. Then, as though the very air around me had solidified, I felt a hand, cold and unseen, press against my chest. It wasn't a physical touch, but a presence, a weight that forced me to my knees. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, their words becoming clearer, more insistent. "You belong to it now." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through every fiber of my being. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears as the pressure around me intensified. The darkness in the room seemed to close in, a thick fog that choked the very light from the gallery. I looked up, my eyes locked on the painting. The face had stopped shifting for a moment, and now it was clear, it was mine. The face in the painting was no longer Samuel's, no longer the figure I had once seen. It was me. My own face, twisted in fear and pain, staring back at me with empty eyes. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat as I realized what was happening. I wasn't just observing the painting. I was becoming a part of it. I could feel it now. My body was fading, slipping away, merging with the darkness that had consumed the painting. The figure, the entity within the frame, was pulling me in, pulling me into its endless void. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the gallery, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had now completely enveloped me. And then, I heard it, the final whisper. "Welcome home." The world around me dissolved into an inky blackness, and for a moment, I thought I had lost all sense of time and space. My body no longer felt like my own. It was as though I were being pulled, dragged through the very fabric of the gallery, swallowed whole by the painting itself. My eyes burned, the air around me growing suffocatingly cold, and yet I couldn't escape. The entity that had once been a shadow now had form. Its fingers were reaching for me, gripping me with a force far stronger than any human hand could possess. I struggled, but it was as if my limbs had turned to stone. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, each beat a desperate cry for release. But the painting, the force within the frame, wouldn't let me go. It was too powerful, too overwhelming. The faces inside the portrait were alive, and they all watched me, their eyes filled with a strange kind of satisfaction. They had been waiting for me, waiting for my soul to join theirs. Through the oppressive darkness, I saw the figure, the one I had been staring at for so long, move again. But this time, it wasn't just a subtle shift. The face in the portrait distorted, stretching and warping like a living nightmare. It grew larger, the edges of the frame cracking under the pressure, the air itself bending around it. And then, it spoke. "Join us." The voice came from everywhere at once, a cacophony of whispers and commands that filled my mind, rattling my very core. I tried to turn away, to escape, but the gallery was no longer just a building. It was a trap, a prison that had ensnared me the moment I set foot inside. The coldness in the air grew even more biting, and I could feel the presence of the portrait wrapping around me, consuming me from the inside out. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, being owned by something ancient and malevolent. I could hear the soft scrape of something, a claw, against the canvas, a sound that made my blood run cold. I looked back at the portrait, and the face within it, my face, was now an expression of pure agony. My eyes, Samuel's eyes, were wide with terror, pleading for release, for mercy. But I had no mercy to give. I could feel myself slipping away, being absorbed by the painting, my soul sinking into its depths, where I would become just another face in the shifting, eternal nightmare. The walls of the gallery began to pulse, vibrating with a rhythm I could feel in my bones. The very air felt alive, as though the building itself were feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every heartbeat. I could sense the other faces in the painting, their silent cries pressing against my consciousness, each one a soul trapped, just like mine. Their suffering was unbearable, but it was too late for me to escape it. I felt my vision blur as the room around me twisted. The once familiar art in the gallery had become a series of warped, grotesque images. The paintings, the very walls, seemed to dissolve into a chaotic blur of color, light, and shadow. It was as though the boundaries of reality had been completely erased, and I was no longer in the world I had known. I was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere worse. And then, I felt it, a sharp pain in my chest, a twisting sensation as though my very essence were being ripped from me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I could feel my body being pulled into the portrait, my skin stretching, my form merging with the faces that surrounded me in the painting. Each one reached out, grabbing me, pulling me deeper into the canvas. I was no longer a separate entity. I was becoming one with the nightmare. My form flickered, shifting between my own face and the distorted, grotesque features of the others trapped within. "You are ours now," the voice echoed again, louder than before, more triumphant. "There is no escape." With the final words, I felt my body, my soul, become one with the painting, my presence now a permanent fixture in the chaotic, shifting mass of faces. The gallery fell silent. I was part of the portrait now, and I would never escape. I had no sense of time, no sense of anything at all. The world around me had been reduced to an endless black void, but it wasn't empty. No, it was filled with the disembodied faces of those who had come before me. They all stared, their eyes wide with fear and pain, trapped in their own cycles of torment. Their features were twisted, melting, shifting in ways that made my stomach churn. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the emptiness. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey me. I was frozen, paralyzed, my very soul being pulled apart and remade. It was as though I no longer existed as a singular person. I was becoming an amalgamation of all the souls trapped in that cursed portrait. I could feel their thoughts, their fears, their endless suffering flooding into me, drowning me. There was no escape from it. I had been a part of something once, something real, something alive. But now, I was nothing more than a fragmented memory, a face in an eternal, shifting nightmare. My own thoughts, my own memories, were becoming muddled and blurred. I couldn't tell where I ended and the others began. Everything was blending together, forming a twisted and distorted version of myself, of them, of us. The gallery was gone. The walls, the paintings, everything had disappeared, swallowed whole by the darkness. But the portrait remained. It always remained. It was the center of everything now, its influence stretching far beyond the confines of the gallery. I felt myself fading, losing my grasp on my own identity. The fear, the terror that had filled me just hours before was now a dull, numbing ache. There was no longer any room for fear. There was only the endless, crushing silence in the faces. The faces never stopped watching. Each one had its own story, its own tragedy. Some of them were angry, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Others were sad, their eyes filled with an unfathomable grief. But all of them were lost. And now, I was one of them. I could feel it now, deep inside. I was just another face, just another soul trapped in the painting, doomed to exist for eternity within its shifting, cursed frame. But even in the silence, there was something else. A sensation, a feeling that crept into my mind like a whisper, an awareness. I wasn't alone in this space. No, there was something else here, something older, something far more powerful than any of the souls trapped within the portrait. I could feel it pressing against me, its presence suffocating, filling every corner of the black void. It was the force behind the portrait. The one who had brought me here. The one who had pulled me into this endless nightmare. It wasn't satisfied with just capturing my soul. No, it wanted more. It wanted to break me down completely, to erase me entirely. I could feel its cold, dark power surrounding me. It was like an immense weight pressing down on my chest, crushing the very essence of who I was. I tried to fight back, to push it away, but my strength was gone. I was nothing. Just a face in the painting, fading with each passing moment. And then, I saw it. A face, emerging from the depths of the darkness, its features twisted and malformed, like a grotesque parody of a human face. It was watching me, its eyes gleaming with malevolent joy, savoring the moment. It didn't speak, but I could feel its message in the pit of my stomach. You will never escape. You belong to it now. The force behind the portrait, the thing that had claimed me, was too strong, too ancient. It was a part of the painting, a part of the curse that had been passed down through generations. It was always waiting, always hungry, always watching for the next victim to wander too close, to look too long. I realized then, with a sickening clarity, that I was never meant to escape. I was never meant to be free. I was just another victim, another soul to be consumed by the painting, to be trapped within its endless, shifting nightmare. And I would remain here, forever, just like the others. Just like Samuel. Just like all of them. The endless cycle would continue. The painting would wait for the next person to notice it. The next person to stare too long. And when that person did, the portrait would claim them, just as it had claimed me. The darkness stretched endlessly around me, consuming what was left of my mind and soul. I could no longer feel my body, no longer sense the world I had once known. The faces around me, twisted, pained, frozen in their eternal suffering, blurred together in a swirling maelstrom of agony. I was a part of it now, just another soul tethered to the canvas, a mere flicker in the massive torment that the portrait had become. But then, something shifted. It wasn't a simple change. It was a violent force, a surge of power that pierced through the suffocating void, snapping at my consciousness like a whip. My sense of self, a small, flickering ember of what I used to be, fought back against the overwhelming pull of the painting. For a fleeting moment, I was aware of the gallery, of the physical space I had once walked in. The cold, sterile walls of the room, the distant hum of fluorescent lights, everything came rushing back to me in a flood of fragmented memories. The force surrounding me, it was real. It wasn't just some intangible nightmare. It was alive. I could feel it tightening around my chest, suffocating me. It was as if the very walls of the gallery were closing in, the pressure mounting until I could barely breathe. The power of the painting was real, a curse older than anything I had imagined. It wasn't just an image, a picture on a canvas. It was a living thing, a sentient force that had been waiting for the right moment, the right soul to consume. I felt it reaching for me again, its fingers like ice-cold tendrils latching onto what remained of my essence, pulling me deeper into the frame. My vision blurred, and I saw myself, my face, once more, but this time it wasn't just trapped in the portrait. No, it was moving, distorting, as though it were alive. The figure I had watched for so long had become me. My expression twisted in agony, my mouth stretched into a silent scream. The force behind the portrait was changing. The presence that had consumed me was no longer just watching. It was controlling. I was losing myself. My thoughts, my memories, my identity, they were slipping away like grains of sand through a clenched fist. The figure in the painting, I was becoming something else. The faces around me began to merge, their features blending together in a grotesque, ever-shifting mask of horror. The painting had become a grotesque mirror, reflecting the twisted, broken souls of all who had gazed into it for too long. And then, I understood. This was it. The end. I was no longer me. I was a part of the painting now, a face among many, forever trapped in the swirling chaos of the portrait. My soul had been bound to it, tethered by a force that would never let go. But even in this suffocating darkness, I could feel the weight of something new. Another presence, another soul, was being drawn to the portrait. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it, hear the faintest stirrings of awareness from the new victim. The cycle was beginning again. I could feel the pulse of anticipation from the painting, as if it were waiting for the new victim to come closer, to look at the portrait, to fall into its trap. The curse was unbroken. It would claim them just as it had claimed me. And when they did, the cycle would begin anew. Another soul would be lost, another face added to the shifting mass of torment. And then, in the darkness, I realized something terrifying. There was no escape. There would never be an escape. The painting had claimed me. It had claimed all of us. And it would continue, its hunger never satisfied, its power unyielding. The faces, the souls, had become one with the portrait. And now, so had I. I couldn't tell if I was still me, or if I had become one of them, one of the faces frozen in the portrait, trapped in the endless shift of terror. The memories that once defined me, my name, my life, my existence, they were fading, slipping away like smoke into the abyss. But there was one thing I still knew, deep in my soul. I was aware. I could still feel the pull of the painting, like cold fingers reaching for me from the depths. But now, it was different. The force that had consumed me, that had torn me from the world of the living, was no longer just a vague presence. It had grown more tangible, more real. It was aware of me. It knew what I was, what I had become. I was no longer just another soul lost in the portrait's depths. I was something else now. Something more. Something essential. I could see the painting again, in all its horrific detail, though it felt like it was no longer a mere image. The faces, the ones that had once been distinct, individual, they were merging now. Their features blurred together into a single mass of distorted, ever-shifting flesh, as if the portrait itself were alive, breathing, pulsating with some dark, ancient force. I could feel the weight of it pressing on me. The painting wasn't just a trap, it was a presence. It had been waiting. It had been watching. And now, it was feeding. I wasn't alone anymore. In the darkness that surrounded me, I could sense the souls of those who had come before me, but their whispers were drowned out by the overwhelming presence of the entity behind the painting. There was no escape. No possibility of rescue. This was it. I had become part of the horror, just another distorted face in an endless gallery of suffering. I tried to scream again, but the sound was swallowed by the void. There was nothing left of my old life, nothing left of the person I once was. I was a fragment, a part of something much larger, much darker. My body, my soul, they no longer belonged to me. They belonged to the painting. But still, I felt it, my face, my identity, slipping further away with each passing second. It wasn't just the faces in the portrait that were changing, I was changing too. My body, my soul, they were becoming part of the endless, shifting nightmare that the portrait had become. I felt my face stretching, warping, becoming one with the other faces, the other souls, as they all merged together into a singular, horrifying mass. It wasn't just a portrait that was alive. It was the curse that had trapped me and all the others within its dark, insidious grip. The faces were not just victims. They were part of it. They were extensions of the entity that had been waiting to claim more, to consume more, to make more souls its own. And now, I understood. I had always been part of it. The gallery, the painting, it had never been a mere object. It had been the vessel, the doorway to something ancient, something horrible. I could feel it now, like a weight in my chest, pressing down on me with a crushing force. The painting had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others. And I would never escape. My reflection, or what remained of it, was slipping away faster than I could comprehend. It was like a dream that you know isn't real but feel powerless to wake up from. I could still sense my own face, buried somewhere deep within the ever-shifting mass of distorted images, but it was no longer mine. It wasn't just a face anymore, it was an identity, a consciousness, being swallowed whole by the painting, consumed by the curse that had taken root in the very fabric of the canvas. The faces. They had all merged, coalesced into a singular entity, an amorphous, grotesque thing that was both familiar and foreign. I could still see them, the faces of those who had gone before me, their pain, their terror, their hopelessness. It was as if I had become part of that collective, part of their eternal suffering. And there it was. For a brief moment, as the swirling mass of faces settled into a twisted semblance of unity, I saw my own face staring back at me from the heart of the chaos. But it wasn't just my face anymore. It was distorted, stretched, warped into something unrecognizable. It was both me and not me, a fractured version of who I had been, tangled up with the others, lost in the eternal dance of suffering that the painting demanded. I reached out, or at least I thought I did. I felt as though my hands were moving, my arms stretching toward the mass of faces, but they were no longer under my control. It was as if my body had lost its purpose, its will. I could feel myself slipping, my form losing its shape as it merged with the collective, as it merged with the curse. And then, the worst part. I felt it, the sense of my identity completely slipping away. Not just my face, my body, but my essence, my soul. The person I had been, the memories I had held so dear, were being slowly erased, sucked into the void, as if they had never existed in the first place. I was becoming part of it, the portrait, the curse. It was inevitable. It was the only path left. The merging wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. My very soul was being woven into the fabric of the painting, becoming just another flickering image among the countless others who had fallen victim. The horror of it all wasn't just the loss of my own self. It was the realization that the painting, this cursed portrait, fed on those who looked too long, too deeply. It wasn't a victim, not anymore. It was a predator, a monstrous thing that devoured souls, twisted them into grotesque shapes, and then consumed them whole. It didn't just trap people. It transformed them, turned them into something else, something less than human, something made of pain, fear, and eternal torment. And I had been part of that transformation. My face, my soul, was becoming one with the other souls, tangled in a web of agony that would never let me go. There was no escape, no salvation. I was lost, trapped in a nightmare that would never end. And then I felt it again. The presence. The pull. The hunger. It wasn't just the faces that were merging. It was me, too. My essence was being woven into the fabric of the curse, my face flickering in and out of the grotesque, shifting mass. The pull grew stronger, the force of the painting, of the curse, tightening around me until I felt like I was suffocating. The faces, the souls, were all around me, their eyes empty, their mouths silent, but they were there. And they knew. They knew what was happening. They had all been here before me. They had all felt this pull, this suffocating darkness, this endless hunger. And now, I was one of them. A face among many. A part of the painting. Forever. I was no longer aware of time. The seconds, the minutes, the hours, they had ceased to exist. All that mattered now was the suffocating darkness of the painting, the crushing weight of the faces, the shifting forms that surrounded me, their silent wails pressing into my very being. They were no longer just images, they were consciousness, they were alive, and they were part of me, and I was part of them. The gallery was nothing but a distant echo in my mind, its walls and floors fading into oblivion. There was no escape. There was no going back. I was being pulled deeper into the curse, deeper into the world that existed within the canvas. I could feel my body dissolving, my spirit disintegrating, slipping away like sand through fingers. It was in this moment of utter hopelessness, of complete surrender to the painting, that I realized the true nature of the curse. The souls trapped within the portrait were not just victims. They were the keepers of the curse, their suffering binding the painting to the physical world. They were the watchers, the silent, endless witnesses to the arrival of each new victim. The faces in the painting were not just faces, they were the souls of those who had once looked into the portrait, just as I had, and had been consumed by it. The souls did not speak, they did not move, but they watched, always watching, always waiting. And now, I was one of them. My eyes, my face, my essence were frozen within the canvas, a part of the eternal cycle of torment and despair. But as I became one with the painting, something within me began to shift. I was no longer just a passive observer, a victim of the curse. I began to feel the presence of the painting, of the force that had drawn me in. It was alive, yes, but it was also something ancient, something older than the gallery itself. It had always been here, waiting, watching, feeding on the souls of those who dared to look too long into its depths. And it wanted more. The more I merged with the faces, the more I understood the true power of the painting. It wasn't just a trap, it was a predator. It fed on the fear, the pain, the despair of those who became trapped within it. It wasn't content with just one soul, it wanted more, it needed more, and it was always hungry. And now, it was my turn to watch. As my face, my soul, faded into the swirling mass of faces, I saw the edges of the canvas shifting. The portrait was growing, expanding, stretching outward, seeking new victims. It wasn't just a painting anymore. It was alive, and it was hungry for more. The gallery was empty now, silent. But it wouldn't remain empty for long. It never did. There would always be someone else, someone who would be drawn in, someone who would look too long, too deeply, at the painting. Someone who would become the next victim, the next face to merge with the others. And when they did, when they gazed upon the portrait, they would feel it, the same pull, the same suffocating force that I had felt. And just like me, they would fall. They would become part of the painting, trapped forever in the endless cycle of torment. And the cycle would continue. Forever. The gallery was quiet, too quiet. Time seemed to have stopped, and yet, I knew that it was only a matter of time before the silence was broken again. The cycle would begin anew. A new victim would come, drawn in by the same eerie force that had lured me. I could feel it now, the pull, as if the very air in the room was thick with the scent of anticipation. The painting hung in the same place, but now it was not just a piece of art, it was a waiting predator, biding its time, knowing that sooner or later, another soul would be foolish enough to look too long. As I became part of the painting, the very fabric of my existence merging with the faces around me, I could feel myself becoming less than human, less than what I had been. I was no longer an individual, I was part of something larger, something older. The faces around me, some familiar, some foreign, were no longer just strangers frozen in time. They had once been like me, once been alive, but now they were part of the endless void, trapped in this eternal prison. And I knew, deep down, that I would never leave. There was no escape from the portrait. It was both a prison and a tomb, a place where souls were devoured and consumed, and then left to wander in endless torment, forever part of the curse. But then, just as my thoughts began to spiral into a hopeless abyss, I felt something. A shift, a movement in the air. The gallery, once so still, seemed to breathe, as if it were alive itself. And then I saw it, through the haze of faces, through the blur of emotions, I saw the figure. A figure that was stepping through the door. It was a woman, young and unassuming, just as I had been. Her eyes were drawn to the painting, as though some invisible force had called to her, as it had called to me. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the portrait, her face reflecting the same mix of curiosity and unease that had once been mine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to warn her, to tell her to turn away, to run and never look back. But my voice, my form, had already been swallowed by the canvas. I was no longer capable of reaching her. I was trapped in the painting, bound to it forever. The woman took another step closer, and I could feel her presence, her life, pulsing in the room. The gallery seemed to grow darker, as if the shadows themselves were reaching out to claim her. She stopped in front of the portrait, her hand hovering over the glass, and I knew that she was about to make the same mistake that I had. She gazed at the painting, entranced by the strange allure of its shifting faces, drawn into the void. Her breath quickened, her eyes widened as she stared into the eyes of the painting, as if trying to decipher the mystery that lay within. And then, in a split second, I saw it. The change. The faces in the portrait shifted once more, their expressions changing, but this time it was not just the usual haunting distortion. This time, the faces seemed to reach toward her, the eyes following her every movement. The expression of the man, the one who had once been the first to fall victim, shifted, as though he recognized her, as though he was acknowledging that she was now the new prey. The woman's body stiffened, her breath shallow, her hand trembling as it hovered near the canvas. The pull was too strong. It was inevitable now. She was already a part of the curse, already drawn into the darkness that waited to claim her. Her body began to sway, her eyes locked in a trance. The painting was calling her, and she was too far gone to resist. And as her fingers brushed the edge of the frame, as she stepped closer, I felt it. The cold, all-encompassing darkness. The pull of the painting. She was no longer a visitor, she was a victim. I watched, helpless, as she was consumed, just as I had been, swallowed by the faces, swallowed by the curse. Her body began to distort, her features blurring and merging with the others, becoming one with the canvas. She, too, was trapped, her soul, her existence, now entwined with the painting, part of its never-ending hunger. The cycle had begun again. The gallery was empty, but it would not stay empty for long. It never did. The haunted room. Have you ever felt that unsettling chill when you step into a place that feels off, as if the very walls are whispering secrets? It was on a warm evening in late September 2023 that I arrived at a hotel on the bustling strip of Las Vegas, eager for a weekend of escape from the mundane routine of life. Little did I know, the neon lights and the sounds of laughter would soon be overshadowed by an eerie mystery that would cling to me long after I left. As I checked into the hotel, I noticed something peculiar, a door at the end of the hallway, sealed with a thick chain and a large padlock. The placard above it read Room 113. The rest of the hallway buzzed with the energy of guests, laughter echoing from their rooms, yet this door stood silent and foreboding. It drew me in, igniting my curiosity. What lay behind it? A part of me dismissed it as just another ghost story to entertain the tourists, but another part, a darker part, felt a pull that I could not ignore. That first night, as I settled into my room, I brushed off the soft sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from the nearby rooms. However, as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere shifted. Instead of the soothing hum of nightlife outside, I began to hear something unsettling, distant thuds and muffled cries. At first, I thought it was merely the remnants of a wild party, but as I strained to listen, I realized the sounds were coming from the sealed room. It was as if someone, or something, was in torment. I tossed and turned, trying to dismiss the eerie sounds as figments of my imagination, but sleep eluded me. With every thud, my heart raced, and a chilling dread seeped into my thoughts. Who was trapped in that room? And why did the hotel staff allow it to remain sealed? As the hours dragged on, the sounds became more frantic, echoing through the stillness of the night. I could hear the unmistakable sound of a struggle, accompanied by a low, desperate moan that sent shivers down my spine. I felt an overwhelming urge to investigate, to confront whatever horror was happening just beyond that door. Yet, I was paralyzed by fear, trapped between the urge to uncover the truth and the instinct to flee. In the midst of this turmoil, I decided to speak to the front desk in the morning. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Perhaps it was just an old plumbing issue or the aftermath of an extravagant party. But deep down, I sensed that the answer would be far more sinister. As dawn broke, illuminating the hotel in a harsh light, I steeled myself to confront the mystery of Room 113. The morning sun streamed through my hotel window, casting a harsh glow on the remnants of the night's horror. I could still hear those haunting sounds echoing in my mind, but I pushed myself to focus on the day ahead. I dressed quickly, the events of the previous night weighing heavily on my chest. The vibrant colors of Las Vegas felt almost too bright, too cheerful for the darkness that lingered in my thoughts. After a quick breakfast, I made my way to the front desk, my heart pounding in my chest. The lobby was bustling, filled with travelers checking out, bellhops wheeling luggage, and families animatedly discussing their plans for the day. I approached the clerk, a woman in her late 20s with bright red lipstick and a polite smile that seemed to falter when she noticed my anxious demeanor. "Excuse me," I began, my voice slightly shaky. "I have a question about Room 113. Her smile faded, and for a brief moment, her eyes flickered with something that resembled fear. "That room is out of order," she replied, her tone clipped. "Out of order?" "I heard noises coming from it last night. It sounded like someone was in trouble." The clerk hesitated, glancing around as if she expected someone to overhear our conversation. "It's just a storeroom. Sometimes the pipes make strange noises, and the old building creaks." But the sounds were different, I pressed, desperation creeping into my voice. "There were screams, and—" "Sir," she interrupted, her tone now firm. You must understand, we don't discuss that room. It's better if you just forget about it. A chill ran down my spine. Her reaction only fueled my curiosity, igniting a determination within me. I felt a need to uncover the truth, to delve into the dark history of room 113. Is there anyone else I can talk to? A manager or someone who knows more about it? The clerk's expression softened slightly, but she shook her head. I'm sorry, but that room is off limits. Please, enjoy your stay. Frustrated, I left the desk and retreated to my room. The hotel was sprawling, with countless rooms and hidden corners, but all I could think about was the sealed door at the end of the hallway. I decided I had to take matters into my own hands. Maybe I could find someone else, a fellow guest or a staff member who would be willing to share the secrets that the front desk was so eager to conceal. I spent the rest of the day wandering the hotel and the nearby attractions, but my mind kept drifting back to that door. I overheard snippets of conversations, guests chatting about their experiences, laughing about the absurdities of Las Vegas, but I felt like an outsider, disconnected from their revelry. Each time I passed by room 113, the tension in my chest tightened, as if the very air around it was thick with dread. That evening, as night fell and the city came alive with its usual vibrancy, I made a decision. I would return to the door and confront whatever lay behind it. I could no longer ignore the call of the unknown. I needed answers, and if that meant risking my safety, so be it. The noises, the screams, they felt like a plea for help, and I couldn't just walk away. As I approached the door once more, the hallway was deserted, the silence amplifying the sounds of my heartbeat. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. I stood before the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the cold metal of the padlock. I could hear the distant sounds of laughter from the other rooms, a stark contrast to the stillness that enveloped me. With a deep breath, I pulled on the chain. It rattled, but the lock held firm. The desperate sounds from the night before echoed in my ears, urging me to try again. I turned my back to the door for a moment, weighing my options. Just as I was about to walk away, a voice broke the silence, soft but unmistakable. Help me. The voice lingered in the air, soft yet insistent, sending shivers down my spine. My heart raced as I turned back to the door, disbelief mingling with dread. I could have sworn I imagined it, but there was a raw urgency to that plea that felt all too real. Hello? I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Is anyone there? Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to listen, but the only sound was the pounding of my own heart. Had I truly heard someone? The thought that I could be losing my mind filled me with a mixture of fear and determination. I couldn't walk away now, not after everything I had already experienced. I took a step back, looking for any sign of how I might gain entry. The chain was heavy, and the lock was old, but perhaps it had weaknesses. I glanced around the hallway, ensuring no one was watching, then crouched down to inspect the lock more closely. My mind raced with possibilities. If I could find a way to unlock it, I might uncover the truth behind those sounds. With a deep breath, I felt for my keycard. It had been a long shot, but maybe I could use it to pry the lock open. Just as I was about to attempt it, the voice came again, clearer this time, tinged with desperation. Please, don't leave me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape the suffocating grip of this place, but the intensity of that plea rooted me in place. I had to know what was happening behind that door. I straightened up and took a deep breath, the air thick with tension. I pulled on the chain again, feeling the lock resist me, but a thought struck me. What if the door was simply stuck? With a surge of adrenaline, I gave the door a hard shove. To my surprise, it creaked open slightly, just enough for a sliver of darkness to seep out. The room beyond was shrouded in shadows, and the air felt heavy with something unnameable, as if the very atmosphere was infused with sorrow. "Is anyone in there?" I called out again, but my voice trembled with uncertainty. I peered into the darkness, straining my eyes to discern any shapes within. The only response was a chill breeze that brushed past me, whispering of memories long forgotten. The urge to retreat pulled at me, but I forced myself to step over the threshold. As I crossed into the room, the darkness seemed to close in around me. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic that made my stomach turn. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to pierce the inky blackness. The beam flickered across the room, revealing peeling wallpaper, dust-coated furniture, and remnants of a life once lived. A small table sat in the corner, its surface cluttered with old newspapers and a cracked mirror that reflected my pale face. But it was the walls that drew my attention, the haunting images scrawled in dark ink, desperate messages that seemed to speak of anguish and despair. "Help us. It's not over. He won't let us go." The words twisted in my gut, a knot of dread forming as I understood their meaning. This was not just a room, it was a tomb of memories, a grave for those who had suffered here. I turned, shining the light around, searching for any sign of life, any indication of who had been trapped in this nightmare. Suddenly, the sound of a soft sob broke the silence, pulling my attention to the far corner of the room. My heart raced as I approached, feeling an almost magnetic pull toward the sound. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice shaking. "Are you okay?" There, partially hidden in the shadows, was a figure huddled against the wall, their body shaking with silent sobs. I knelt down, my heart pounding in my chest. "What happened? Who are you?" The figure looked up, and I was met with hollow eyes that seemed to hold a universe of pain. "You shouldn't be here," they whispered, their voice cracking. "It's not safe. He will come for you too." My mind raced, questions flooding in. Who was he? What had happened in this room? But before I could ask, the figure's expression shifted from fear to horror, their eyes wide with terror. "Run," they gasped, backing away as if sensing a presence in the room. And then, in that suffocating darkness, I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, a weight in the air that pressed down on me, stifling. The very shadows seemed to pulse and shift, coiling around me like a living thing. I turned to flee, but the doorway, the only escape, was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Panic surged as I was engulfed in shadow, and I heard the low rumble of laughter, dark and twisted, echoing in the suffocating void. The darkness enveloped me like a heavy blanket, each breath becoming a laborious effort. I could still hear the figure's terrified whispers echoing in my mind, urging me to escape, but the oppressive shadows held me in a vice-like grip. Panic surged within me as I fumbled to find the doorway that had vanished behind me, my heart racing in a wild rhythm of fear. "Help me!" I shouted into the suffocating darkness, but my voice felt small and insignificant against the overwhelming weight of despair that filled the room. The shadows around me seemed to throb and pulse, as if alive, and I could feel a presence lurking just beyond the edge of my perception, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the sobbing figure pushed against the wall, eyes wide with terror as they pointed to something behind me. "He's here," they gasped, their voice trembling. I turned, and a chill washed over me, freezing me in place. Emerging from the darkness was a shape, indistinct yet terrifying, as if it were stitched together from the shadows themselves. I could sense its malevolence, a dark energy that radiated from it like heat from a fire. The figure loomed larger, and I felt my body freeze, caught in the grip of an instinctual dread. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do anything, but I couldn't move. "Don't look at him," the figure urged, but my gaze was drawn inexorably toward the entity. Its features were shrouded in darkness, a grotesque mockery of a human form. Eyes glinted like cold stars, devoid of warmth or mercy, and a grin stretched across its face, a chilling smile that seemed to taunt me with the knowledge of my fate. With a surge of adrenaline, I forced my legs to move. I spun around, my heart pounding as I searched for any hint of a way out. The shadows twisted and morphed, creating a labyrinth of dark shapes, but I pressed forward, stumbling through the debris of a life long forgotten. The light from my phone flickered ominously, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, mocking my every step. "Run!" the figure cried again, their voice cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. I took off in the direction where I last remembered the door being, my breaths coming in frantic gasps. I could feel the presence behind me, a cold breath on my neck, urging me onward. Finally, I spotted it, a glimmer of light breaking through the darkness where the door had once stood. I charged forward, desperation fueling my every step. As I reached out for the doorframe, I felt a pull, as if the shadows were trying to drag me back. My fingers grazed the edge of the doorway, and I lunged through, tumbling into the hallway beyond. I collapsed onto the cold floor, gasping for breath as I looked back into the room. The door remained ajar, the darkness swirling within as if it were alive, hungry. I scrambled to my feet and slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the emptiness of the hallway. Heart pounding, I leaned against the door, shaking uncontrollably. What had just happened? I had escaped, barely, but the shadows still felt alive in my mind, clawing at my thoughts. The echoes of despair and the figure's frightened face haunted me. I needed answers, but first, I had to find a safe place to gather my thoughts. Stumbling down the hallway, I turned the corner and spotted a small lounge area filled with plush chairs and low tables. Guests milled about, chatting and laughing, oblivious to the horrors that lay just beyond the door I had closed. I sank into a chair, trying to calm my racing heart, but the feeling of dread clung to me like a second skin. What had that figure meant when they said, "He will come for you too"? Who, or what, was this malevolent force? I pulled out my phone, hands shaking as I opened a search engine. I typed in the name of the hotel, hoping to uncover its history, to find any clue that might shed light on what had transpired in room 113. As I scrolled through the results, my eyes widened. News articles from years past began to populate the screen, reports of a tragic event, a mysterious disappearance of guests, whispers of hauntings and strange occurrences. One headline caught my attention: "Family vanishes in hotel room, mystery remains unsolved." The article detailed the story of a family who had checked into the hotel several years prior. They had been reported missing after a series of bizarre occurrences, strange noises echoing through the hallways, and a witness who claimed to have seen shadowy figures lurking near their room. The article speculated about the possibility of foul play, but no evidence was ever found. The room was sealed, and the family became just another ghost story that haunted the hotel's history. A chill ran down my spine. The family, the figure I had seen, it all began to connect. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden chill in the air, and I glanced up to see the lounge's atmosphere shifting. Laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence as the lights flickered overhead. I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, a prickling at the back of my neck. I hurriedly closed my phone, stuffing it back into my pocket as I glanced around. Guests were starting to look unsettled, their eyes darting toward the entrance as if sensing something was amiss. I needed to get out of this hotel, but a strange sense of urgency drove me to find the figure I had encountered. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to find that person, to understand what they knew. I rushed back toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I approached room 113 again, the air felt thick, charged with anticipation. "Help me!" The voice echoed once more, pulling me forward. I felt as if I were caught in a spell, the voice beckoning me closer to the cursed door of room 113. The shadows danced along the walls, swirling and shifting as if alive, while the remnants of the hotel buzzed faintly in the background. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding against my ribs, and approached the door once more. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated, recalling the figure's terrified warning. "He will come for you too." The fear pulsed through me, but the plea for help ignited a spark of courage. I had to know more. I needed to confront whatever lay within. I twisted the handle and pushed the door open, bracing myself for the unknown. The room was dimly lit, shadows clinging to the corners like cobwebs. I stepped inside cautiously, the air heavy with the scent of decay. My phone's light flickered weakly, illuminating the remnants of a nightmare, old furniture, scattered debris, and the haunting. Scribbles on the walls that whispered of despair. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I forced myself to keep moving. "Please, don't leave," the voice urged again, softer this time, filled with an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. I turned, my eyes scanning the darkness until they fell upon the figure once more, now closer than before. They were seated against the wall, their body trembling, their expression a mix of terror and desperation. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice echoing against the silence. "What happened here? Why are you trapped?" The figure looked up at me with those hollow eyes, tears streaking their face. "I'm just a victim, like the others. He keeps us here, reliving our pain over and over." "Who is he?" I pressed, feeling a sense of urgency swell within me. "What does he want?" A shudder rippled through the figure as they spoke, their voice barely above a whisper. "He feeds on our fear. He's not just a man, he's a shadow, a darkness that preys on the vulnerable. We can't escape him. No one can." The weight of their words settled heavily on my chest, and I felt the temperature drop further, a chill crawling up my spine. I glanced back at the door, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. "I have to get out of here," I said, almost pleading. "Can't you come with me?" "I can't," the figure sobbed, shaking their head. "I'm trapped here, but you," their gaze flicked nervously toward the shadows, "you still have a chance. You have to warn others. Tell them not to come here. He'll find you if you stay." Just then, a low rumble reverberated through the room, shaking the very walls. The air grew heavier, and I felt the shadows creeping closer, coiling around my legs like snakes. A cold voice, deep and resonant, filled the room, chilling me to the bone. "You should not have come here." I turned, my heart racing as the malevolent presence loomed just beyond my vision, shrouded in darkness. It was a swirling mass of shadows, and from within, the eyes glinted with a predatory hunger that sent me reeling backward. "I can't let you leave," the voice echoed, dripping with malice. "You belong to me now." In a blind panic, I stumbled toward the exit, but the shadows surged forward, coiling around me like a suffocating blanket. I felt my breath quicken, terror gripping my chest as I fought against the dark tendrils that seemed to wrap around my limbs, pulling me back into the abyss. "Run," the figure cried, desperation fueling their voice. Fight it. I could hear the whispers of the trapped souls, the echoes of their despair rising up to drown me. Help us. Don't let him take you. Summoning every ounce of strength, I fought against the shadows, pushing through the weight of the darkness. I lunged for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the pull of the darkness, the oppressive force trying to drag me back, but the figure's voice anchored me. Don't give in, they shouted. You're stronger than he is. With a final surge of determination, I threw myself through the doorway, slamming it shut behind me. I collapsed against the door, gasping for air, the coldness of the room lingering in my bones. But the shadows were not gone. I could feel them pressing against the door, whispering promises of despair. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet, glancing around the empty hallway, the vibrant lights of the hotel now feeling hollow and distant. I had to get out, had to escape before the darkness caught up with me. I sprinted down the hallway, the sounds of laughter and chatter from the guests fading into a distant memory. The world outside felt surreal, the bright lights of Las Vegas mocking the horror I had just faced. I needed to find someone who could help, someone who would listen. As I reached the elevator, I slammed the button repeatedly, my eyes darting down the hall, half expecting the shadows to surge forth any moment. The elevator doors opened, and I rushed inside, my breath quickening as I pressed the button for the ground floor. The descent felt agonizingly slow, each moment stretching into an eternity. I could feel the heaviness of the presence weighing on my shoulders, as if it were lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. My fingers trembled on the railing as the elevator lurched downward, the numbers above flickering like a heartbeat. When the doors finally opened, I burst into the lobby, scanning the area for anyone who might help. The familiar sounds of the bustling hotel surrounded me, but my heart raced as I searched for someone who would believe me, who could help stop the darkness that clung to me like a shadow. Sir, are you all right? A hotel staff member rushed toward me, concern etched on their face. You look pale. I grabbed their arm, my voice urgent. You have to listen to me. Room 113, there's something wrong. People are trapped in there. Their expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing their face, but before they could respond, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing from the hallway. The kind of laughter that sends chills down your spine, the kind that promises only darkness. They've come for you, the staff member whispered, their eyes widening with fear. You have to get out of here. My heart sank as I realized the truth they already knew. Panic surged within me, and I felt the shadows tightening their grip around my heart. The staff member's warning resonated in my mind as I glanced toward the hallway, where the laughter continued to echo, a haunting melody that promised terror. I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let it take anyone else. Where's the exit? I gasped, gripping the staff member's arm tighter. We need to get out of here, now. They hesitated for a moment, fear flickering in their eyes. Follow me. There's a back exit we can use. Together, we hurried through the lobby, weaving past startled guests who eyed me with confusion. The closer we got to the exit, the more palpable the darkness felt, as if it were clawing at the edges of my vision, eager to pull me back into its embrace. As we reached a set of double doors that led outside, the laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls in a maddening symphony. I could feel it now, the shadows swirling, pushing against me, eager to drag me back into their depths. The staff member opened the door just wide enough for us to slip through, urgency etched into their features. Go, they urged, shoving me forward. Get out. I stumbled into the cool night air, the brightness of the Las Vegas Strip a stark contrast to the darkness I had just escaped. But even as I ran into the open, I felt the shadows trailing behind me, whispering my name, their cold fingers reaching out as if they could still claim me. "Wait," I called back to the staff member, who hesitated at the threshold. "You can't go back in there. It's not safe." They looked torn, glancing back toward the hotel as if it were calling them home. "I have to warn the others," they shouted back. "I can't let them get trapped." Before I could protest, they disappeared back into the hotel, leaving me standing alone in the bright lights of the Strip. My heart raced, torn between fear for the staff member and the desperate need to escape the darkness that felt so close behind me. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. I had to warn others, to make sure no one else fell victim to the horrors lurking in room 113. I turned away from the hotel and began to run, my feet pounding against the pavement as I sought refuge among the throngs of people who filled the streets. The air was electric with energy, laughter, and music spilling from the nearby casinos and bars. I pushed through the crowd, desperately searching for someone who would listen. My mind raced with thoughts of the trapped figure, the shadows that hungered for fear, and the staff member who might already be in danger. I finally spotted a group of police officers standing near a food stall, their presence reassuring against the chaos of the night. I approached them, my heart pounding. "Please, you have to help me. There's something wrong at the hotel. People are in danger." They turned to me, expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. "Calm down, miss. What hotel are you talking about?" "Hotel Mirage," I exclaimed, urgency rising in my voice. "Room 113, there are spirits trapped in there, and a dark presence. People need to be warned." One of the officers raised an eyebrow, skepticism flickering across his face. "Are you saying there are ghosts? That's a bit hard to believe, don't you think?" "I'm not crazy. I've seen it. I felt it," I pleaded, my voice rising in desperation. "Please, you have to check it out before more people go missing." The officers exchanged glances, and I could see the wheels turning in their minds. "We'll send someone to look into it," one officer said cautiously, clearly doubting my account. "But you need to stay calm." "Calm?" I echoed, shaking my head. "You don't understand. It's not just a story. It's real, and it's dangerous." Before they could respond, I turned back toward the hotel, anxiety rising like bile in my throat. I needed to go back, not just for the staff member, but for the souls trapped within that dark room. They needed help, and if the police wouldn't act, I had to take matters into my own hands. "I have to go back," I whispered to myself, determination filling me. I would face whatever awaited me, even if it meant confronting the darkness alone. I turned and began to walk back toward the hotel, each step feeling heavier than the last as doubt and fear waged war within me. As I approached the entrance, the laughter and music faded behind me, replaced by a haunting silence. I stepped inside, the air thick with tension, and my heart raced as I made my way back to the cursed room. The lobby was empty, the staff having retreated to the back, leaving me alone with the shadows. I paused outside room 113, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear whispers inside, a cacophony of pleading voices echoing in the darkness. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The darkness enveloped me immediately, and the weight of despair pressed down on my shoulders. "I'm here to help you," I called into the shadows, hoping to reach the souls trapped within. "I won't let you suffer anymore." A low, cold laugh reverberated through the room, and I could feel the oppressive presence gathering around me, coiling like a serpent ready to strike. "You're brave, little one," the dark voice sneered, echoing with malice. "But bravery is no match for the shadows." I steeled myself, pushing back against the fear that threatened to consume me. "I know what you are. You feed on fear, and I won't give you that power." In that moment, I recalled the figure's words, the way they had urged me to warn others. I would not give in to despair. I wouldn't let the shadows win. "You may have trapped others here, but I will not be your victim." The laughter grew more sinister, the shadows swirling closer, but I focused on the warmth of the memories I held, my family, my friends, the love that anchored me in this world. "I am not alone," I shouted, and I felt a flicker of light pushing back against the darkness. Suddenly, a blinding flash erupted from the depths of the room, illuminating the shadows and driving them back momentarily. I could see the trapped souls, their faces twisted in anguish, and I reached out to them. "You're not alone either. I will help you." The warmth grew stronger, and I felt the presence of the lost souls around me, their despair turning to hope as they gathered their strength. Together, we stood against the darkness, refusing to let it consume us. With one final surge of determination, I focused on the light within me, allowing it to radiate outward. The shadows shrieked, the cold laughter turning to wails of rage. "No! You cannot escape." But I would not be swayed. "We are free," I shouted, and as the light surged brighter, the shadows recoiled, retreating into the corners of the room. The door behind me burst open, and I could feel the outside world beckoning, a world filled with life, laughter, and light. With a final push, the trapped souls surged toward the exit, their forms dissolving into beams of light that danced around me, pulling me along. Together, we surged through the doorway and into the hallway, the darkness swirling behind us, unable to follow. We emerged into the light of the hotel, the laughter of guests filling the air. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath as the warmth enveloped me, the souls finally freed from their torment. The hotel around me began to shimmer, the shadows dissipating like mist in the morning sun. As I looked up, the staff member I had met earlier rushed toward me, their eyes wide with disbelief. "What happened? We thought we lost you." I freed them, I breathed, tears of relief streaming down my face. "They're free now." In that moment, I knew I had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. The hotel would still hold its secrets, its haunted past, but the shadows no longer had power over me or the souls I had helped free. I stood up, feeling the light of hope surrounding me, knowing that the battle against darkness was never truly over, but I was ready for whatever came next. And as I stepped out into the bright lights of Las Vegas, I promised myself that I would never forget the importance of light in the face of darkness, nor the strength of those who had fought alongside me, forever etched in my heart. The Restoration Workshop. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? That prickling sensation at the back of your neck, even when you know you're alone? It started that way for me. As a restorer in my small, cluttered workshop in New York, I'm no stranger to eerie silences or late nights. My days are spent reviving remnants of the past, antique chairs, vases, and trinkets long forgotten. These objects come with histories, stories they seem to carry like invisible shadows. And lately, there's been a weight to the air, something dark and heavy pressing down on me. I was working late one night, bent over a cracked porcelain figurine, concentrating on matching the delicate colors, when I heard a faint creak behind me. I glanced back, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. just the dim outlines of forgotten sculptures and half-finished frames leaning against the walls. The only sound was the ticking of my wall clock, each tick magnified in the quiet room. I shook it off. Old buildings had their quirks. And my workshop was especially drafty, with floors that groaned under the slightest pressure. It was nothing. Just the mind playing tricks, I told myself. But as the nights went on, it happened again and again. At first, I convinced myself it was just fatigue. I had been working late, pouring hours into these pieces. Restoration requires patience, steady hands, and focus, and sometimes, when I'm engrossed, I lose track of time. But the more I ignored the sounds, the stranger they became. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, like someone pacing just out of sight. They would stop when I stopped, like an echo of my own movements. One evening, I was cleaning a tarnished silver pocket watch, my hand steady, almost on autopilot, when I felt it again. That sense of being watched was so intense it practically buzzed in the air. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Then, from somewhere just behind me, came the unmistakable sound of a quiet sigh. My heart thundered, but I didn't dare turn around. I forced myself to keep working, every muscle in my body tense, straining to pick up any further sounds. But the silence that followed was so thick, it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Minutes passed, each one dragging painfully slowly, until finally, I forced myself to exhale, relaxing just a bit. I was alone. I had to be. The relief didn't last long. When I finally gathered the courage to glance behind me, the room was exactly as it should be. Shadows clung to every corner, my tools were neatly arranged on the bench, and nothing seemed out of place. I tried to laugh it off. Who would believe a restorer being haunted by his own work? The absurdity of it almost brought me comfort. But as I turned back to the pocket watch in my hands, I noticed something odd. The watch's glass, which had been cracked, was now shattered completely, tiny shards clinging to my gloves. A wave of confusion and unease washed over me. I'd been so careful, my touch light as a feather, yet here it was, destroyed. I stood there, staring at it, and a creeping thought tugged at me. Had it broken on its own? Or had someone, or something, broken it for me? The thought made my skin crawl. The stillness of the room was different now, like it was holding a secret it wouldn't share. I set the broken watch down, trying to calm my racing mind. It was just an accident. Nothing more. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned back to my workbench, brushing off the incident and grabbing a small, wooden figurine, a delicate, hand-carved piece that looked centuries old. The wood was dry, brittle, and covered in a layer of dust as if it hadn't been touched for years. Just as I was about to start cleaning it, a cold draft swept through the room, so sharp it made me shiver. But the windows were closed, and there was no one else here. The chill lingered, sinking into my bones. My fingers were numb as I held the figurine, the air around me dense and almost watchful. I forced myself to focus, ignoring the unsettling feeling that pressed down on me like a weight. Slowly, I worked on the figurine, brushing off the dust and inspecting each fragile detail. But then, just as I lifted the brush, I felt a subtle tug against my hand, as if someone were guiding me. My pulse quickened, but I couldn't seem to let go. And then, the figurine cracked. The soft, splintering sound was so distinct it made me jump. I stared down in disbelief as a deep fracture split across its body. I couldn't believe it. I had barely touched the figurine, yet it lay in my hands, split open as though it had been forcibly broken. I ran my finger along the crack, feeling its sharp edges, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were steady, careful. I knew this wasn't my fault. But who or what had done this? A nervous laugh escaped me, but it sounded hollow in the silence of the room. Just tired, I whispered to myself, almost pleading with the darkness around me to let this be true. Long hours, that's all. But a sudden thought chilled me, 2 broken items in a single evening. This wasn't a coincidence. The sounds, the draft, the cold presence. It felt like someone was here, watching my every move, nudging my hand toward mistakes I'd never make on my own. I set the fractured figurine down carefully, staring at it as if expecting it to fix itself. I stood there, frozen, feeling as though I were intruding in my own workshop, a place I had spent countless hours. It was mine, yet now it felt foreign. My gaze drifted around the workshop, landing on every shadowed corner, every piece of forgotten art leaning against the walls, each one now holding an eerie stillness. My heart pounded, and I felt that prickling sensation at the back of my neck again. Was someone, no, something, here with me? The thought seemed absurd, yet I couldn't ignore the signs. I glanced at the clock, hoping it was time to call it a night, but it was only midnight. Too early to leave by my usual standards. But maybe tonight could be an exception. Maybe some sleep would settle my nerves, bring me back to reality. Just as I reached for my coat, a faint metallic sound echoed through the room, sharp and distinct, like a small object falling. I turned toward my desk, dread creeping up my spine. One of the brass frames I'd been restoring was now lying on the floor, face down. I hadn't touched it. No one had. I approached it cautiously, kneeling to pick it up. The frame was bent, the glass cracked. I examined it, my hand shaking slightly. This piece was pristine just hours ago. It couldn't have just fallen. I held the broken frame, my fingers tracing the jagged edges of the cracked glass. The damage was beyond what a simple fault could have caused. It was as if the frame had been forced down with intention, broken deliberately. My pulse quickened, and a chill crawled up my spine, tightening around my throat like a cold hand. The air felt thicker now, oppressive, and an uncanny silence filled the room, as though the very walls were holding back a scream. I forced myself to breathe, to shake off the unease pressing in on me, but a nagging thought wormed its way into my mind. Hadn't I come across this frame before, earlier today? I recalled placing it carefully on the edge of the work table, far from the edge. I hadn't touched it since. It was almost as if it had moved, on its own. But that was impossible, I reminded myself. Maybe a draft or my own clumsiness caused it to fall, I reasoned. Yet, even as I tried to calm myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The broken frame seemed like a message, an urgent whisper from something unseen. As I set the broken frame back on the table, my hands were trembling. I felt foolish, haunted by an old piece of brass and glass. But no amount of logic could ease the sinking feeling twisting in my gut. I'd spent years in this workshop, and it had always been my refuge, a space that was mine alone. Now, it felt invaded. I leaned back against my workbench, rubbing my temples, trying to make sense of it all. I was alone, or at least I was supposed to be. Yet every sound, every strange occurrence, felt like a sign that someone else was here, someone I couldn't see. The silence stretched on, thick and expectant, as though waiting for me to make the next move. My gaze shifted toward a large, ornate mirror propped against the far wall, waiting for repairs. Its surface was dusty, dulled by time, but in the dim light, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow, just for an instant, right behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The workshop was empty, quiet, and still. The mirror only reflected me, standing alone, pale and wide-eyed in the dim light. But the more I stared, the more I felt that something was watching me back. I tore my gaze away from the mirror, my heart hammering so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that it was just exhaustion and overactive imagination playing tricks. But something deep inside told me otherwise. I turned back to the table, hands shaking as I reached for a small porcelain vase. Its delicate patterns seemed almost comforting, a reminder of the ordinary work I was used to. As I examined a fine crack running along its edge, the silence broke with a sudden, sharp whisper, so close it felt like it was right next to my ear. "Fix it." The voice was faint, hoarse, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. I dropped the vase in shock, stumbling back as it shattered on the floor, shards scattering across the wooden boards. I backed away, my mind reeling. That voice, my own name spoken in a tone filled with something ancient and desperate. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out. But my feet felt rooted in place, held by some unseen force. It was as if the room itself was alive, holding me there, compelling me to listen. The next morning, I arrived at the workshop, half convinced that everything I experienced the night before was just a bad dream. Maybe I had worked myself into exhaustion, let my mind get the better of me. But as soon as I stepped inside, a chill settled over me, a warning, as if the walls themselves remembered. The remnants of the shattered vase still littered the floor, each shard glinting in the early morning light. I bent down to gather them, feeling a pang of guilt. This piece had been one of my favorites, with delicate hand-painted flowers that now lay fractured and lifeless. As I collected the pieces, a familiar unease twisted in my stomach, a memory of that hoarse whisper echoing in my mind, "Fix it." I tried to brush it off, focusing on the task at hand. As I worked, I began to notice other strange details around the room. Objects seemed slightly out of place, shifted from where I'd left them. A brush lay on the opposite side of the table from where I usually kept it. A stack of books leaned precariously, though I always left them neatly arranged. And then I noticed a small, folded note resting in the center of my workbench. I was certain it hadn't been there the night before. My hand shook as I picked it up, slowly unfolding the yellow paper. In faded ink, just 2 words were scrawled across the page: "Help me." I stared at the note, my mind spinning as I tried to process what I was seeing. The handwriting was unfamiliar, jagged, yet the words felt personal, urgent. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I tried to steady my breath. Who had left this note? How did it end up here? I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. But the workshop remained silent, as still as it had been the night before. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock, its rhythmic ticking now strangely oppressive, like the heartbeat of the room itself. The note was old. The paper was brittle, almost disintegrating at the edges. And there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. The ink had smudged in places, as though it had been written in haste, under duress. It was almost as if someone had written it in a panic, desperate to communicate something important, something they couldn't finish. I crumpled the note, unable to look at it any longer, but my mind kept racing. "Help me." The words echoed in my head, louder than the ticking of the clock, louder than the silence. Who was trying to reach out to me, and why? Suddenly, I felt the air shift again. A draft, cold and sharp, blew through the workshop, stirring the dust in the corners. It was unmistakable. It was the same sensation I'd felt the night before, the same presence lingering in the room. But this time, it wasn't just a feeling. The air was thick, heavy with something unexplainable, something that shouldn't be here. I looked toward the mirror. It was standing against the wall, its surface dark and untouched, but in that moment, it felt alive. I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. It stood there, silent and imposing, its glass reflecting nothing but the dim, cluttered workshop. Yet the longer I stared, the more I began to feel the familiar sensation of being watched. My skin tingled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a hesitant step toward it, each movement feeling unnaturally slow, as though the room itself was holding me back. The air grew colder, and I felt the presence again, like a weight pressing against my chest, urging me forward. With a trembling hand, I reached out and touched the cold, smooth surface of the mirror. The instant my fingers made contact, a jolt of ice ran through my veins. The air seemed to vibrate with a strange energy, and the faintest of whispers brushed against my ear. It was the same voice from the night before, the same hoarse, desperate tone. "Fix it, before it's too late." I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. The voice was unmistakable, clearer now, almost real, and it was coming from the mirror. I felt a deep, irrational pull to look closer, but I couldn't. My hands shook violently, and I pressed them against my eyes, trying to block out the image that had begun to form in the glass. For a moment, there was nothing but the reflection of the workshop, my workshop. But then, slowly, a figure began to appear in the mirror's depths. At first, it was just a blur, an indistinct shape, but as I squinted, I saw it more clearly, a man, hunched over a workbench, his face twisted in concentration. He was surrounded by scattered tools and pieces of broken art. His movements were jerky, frantic, as though he were desperately trying to fix something I couldn't see. I could feel the tears of frustration welling up in my eyes. I had to know. Who was this man? Why was he here? What was he trying to tell me? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the reflection in the mirror. The figure, though blurry at first, became sharper with each passing second until I could see him clearly, his hunched shoulders, his fingers moving frantically across the workbench, his face etched with a deep, desperate urgency. He was working on something. It was as if he didn't even notice me watching, or maybe, in some strange way, he knew I was there. He was wearing clothes that looked out of place, an old, worn suit with frayed cuffs, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a century-old photograph. His face was gaunt, pale, his features obscured by shadows, but there was something about him that tugged at my memory, something familiar and unsettling. As I stared at him, something caught my eye, something on the workbench beside him. It was a broken object, just like the ones I had been restoring. I leaned forward, squinting to get a better look, but the moment I focused on it, the reflection in the mirror flickered. The figure's hands trembled, the pieces on the table scattered like they were being swept by an invisible force. Then, without warning, the reflection shifted. The man was suddenly looking up at me, his eyes wide and desperate. His lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, the whisper returned, louder now, as if it were coming from the mirror itself, from the man's very being. "Fix it," he rasped. I can't. The whisper became more frantic, his hands now shaking as he reached toward the mirror, toward me. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The image in the glass began to distort, the man's face warping as if he were trapped inside, unable to escape. I backed away from the mirror, feeling a cold sweat break out on my skin. The room was spinning, and the shadows around me seemed to grow longer, stretching toward me like hands trying to pull me into the glass. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here anymore. But before I could turn to leave, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper, it was a scream. Raw, desperate, and full of pain. "Help me." The voice echoed in the room, the sound reverberating off the walls, drowning out everything else. And then, just as quickly as it started, the scream was gone. The room fell silent once more. The mirror was once again just a mirror, reflecting only my wide-eyed, terrified face. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. What was happening? Was this real? Was the man in the mirror me? Or someone who had been here before me? The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Something inside me knew that if I left now, I might never understand what was happening, what had happened. But the longer I stood there, the more the feeling grew stronger. I wasn't just dealing with broken objects. I was dealing with something far older, far more sinister. Something that had been waiting for me. The workshop felt colder now, the temperature dropping steadily, seeping into my bones. I took a hesitant step back from the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. What had just happened? The scream, the voice, it all felt too real, too close. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I forced myself to turn away from the mirror, unwilling to let it trap me again. I walked across the room, trying to gather my thoughts, but the sense of unease pressed down on me like an invisible weight. My hands were clammy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that knew me too well. The workshop had always been a quiet place, a sanctuary where I could lose myself in my work. But now, it felt like a tomb. Every object, every tool, seemed to watch me, judging me. I tried to focus on the pieces scattered across my workbench to regain some sense of normalcy, but the strange occurrences from the night before kept flooding my mind. The broken objects, the whispering voice, the figure in the mirror, it was all connected. And I was at the center of it, whether I liked it or not. I moved to the far corner of the room, where a large canvas stood, partially covered by a dusty sheet. I hadn't noticed it before, but as I approached, I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. The fabric seemed to shimmer slightly, as if it were alive. My fingers trembled as I lifted the sheet, revealing a painting, unfinished, but eerily familiar. It was a portrait of a man, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with a deep sadness. The same man from the mirror. But this was different. The eyes in the painting were more alive. They seemed to follow me, shifting as I moved. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. The painting, like the mirror, was watching me, waiting for something. I could feel my pulse quicken. This was no coincidence. The man in the mirror, the whisper, the note, it was all leading me here. To this painting. I felt a sudden compulsion to know more, to understand who this man was, and why his presence had haunted me the way it had. But as I reached toward the canvas, my hand hovering just above the frame, a voice, this time from the air itself, whispered once more, barely audible but unmistakable. "Don't touch it." I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly withdrew my hand. The room was still. The silence was deafening. Had I imagined it? Or was the warning coming from the painting itself? I couldn't be sure. But something inside me told me that touching it would be a mistake that could undo everything. With a deep breath, I backed away from the canvas, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed that I had to find out more about this man, about the painting, about the voice. I had to understand what was happening to me. And so, I turned toward the workshop's one other source of information, the dusty old bookshelves along the wall, filled with ancient tomes on art restoration and history. One of them might have the answers I needed. As I began to scan the shelves, my eyes stopped on an old, leather-bound journal tucked between two larger volumes. It looked different from the others, worn, with pages that seemed to have yellowed with age. I pulled it down carefully, the weight of it almost pulling me forward as I opened the cover. The first page was filled with faded, spidery handwriting. It read, "The Restorer's Curse." A chill ran down my spine as I began to read. The words on the first page seemed to burn into my mind as I read, the ink still visible despite its age. It was written in a hand that wasn't unfamiliar to me, too familiar. It was a script I had seen before, a handwriting I had once dismissed as the scribbles of a forgotten artist. The journal began with the name Adrian Cole. It was the same name I had read on the signature of a damaged painting I had worked on months ago. The same signature that had seemed so wrong. I turned the page, my hands trembling. The writing continued, and the story it told made my stomach twist. To restore is to undo. Each piece of art is a reflection of the soul that created it. But some souls, they cannot rest. They cannot let go of their work, their mistakes. I paused, the words sinking deep into my chest. I have restored countless pieces over the years, but this felt different. Every instinct told me that Adrian Cole had not just been a painter, he had been something far more than that. Something that didn't belong in this world anymore. I continued reading, my eyes scanning the lines as they grew darker. When the artist's spirit is torn from the body, bound to the works left undone, it becomes restless. The pieces, once finished, now carry an essence. A lingering need to be perfected. And if they are not, if they are touched by the wrong hands, they will call out. The words blurred as I read them, as though the ink itself were bleeding across the page. I tried to steady myself, but I couldn't. My mind raced, realizing with growing horror that the stories in this journal weren't just myth, they were warnings. Warnings about the very thing that had been haunting me. I flipped through the pages, eager to read more, but each one felt heavier, more suffocating. The warnings grew more desperate as I read. Adrian Cole had tried to fix his own broken work, to restore after his death, but his soul had been trapped in the unfinished pieces. His spirit had lingered, angry, frustrated, lost. And now, his curse was reaching out to me. I could feel it then, a presence, cold and suffocating. The air thickened, and I suddenly became aware of how silent the room had grown. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The journal fell from my hands, landing on the floor with a heavy thud. I looked up, my eyes darting around the room, every shadow now a potential threat. The voice that had whispered to me earlier, the figure in the mirror, the feeling of being watched, it all made sense now. Adrian Cole's spirit was still here, still desperate to complete his work, to force someone, anyone, to fix his broken art. I stood frozen in the center of the room, torn between fleeing and knowing that I had no choice but to face it. I had to finish what I had started. To restore the work, to understand the curse, or risk becoming another part of it. Another lost soul. The mirror caught my attention again, its surface now reflecting not just my face, but the reflection of the unfinished painting in the background, its features distorted and twisted. The man's eyes locked onto mine, full of desperation. And then, for the first time, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a faint smile, almost cruel in its promise. "Fix it," the voice rasped once more, this time echoing from all directions, not just from the mirror. It was all around me, suffocating. I had no choice. I had to finish it. But as I turned toward the canvas, a sudden realization hit me like a punch to the gut. What if I wasn't meant to restore it? What if this wasn't just about fixing broken art? What if the true curse was the art itself? And with that thought, the room seemed to close in around me. The cold grip of realization tightened around my chest. As I stared at the unfinished portrait of Adrian Cole, something in my mind snapped into place. What if I wasn't supposed to fix it? What if this was all part of the curse, an endless loop of restoration that would never bring peace, only more torment? The painting wasn't merely a work of art, it was a trap, a prison, a place where the spirit of the artist had been bound to suffer for eternity. The air in the room seemed to shift again, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. I could feel Adrian Cole's presence, his anger, his frustration, growing stronger with each passing second. I had to stop. I couldn't finish this painting. I couldn't risk becoming part of his curse. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was too late. The pull was too strong. My hands trembled as I reached for the brushes, as though they were moving on their own. The temptation to restore the painting, to make it perfect, as if that would set things right, was overwhelming. I tried to resist, but the force was undeniable. I dipped the brush into the paint, the strokes flung onto the canvas before I could even think. The image of Adrian Cole became clearer with each brushstroke, his face growing more defined, more alive. But the eyes, they were wrong. They were too alive, too knowing. They were watching me, guiding me, pushing me forward. I couldn't stop. The brush moved faster, and the room began to feel smaller, as if the walls were closing in around me. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse hammering in my throat. Every time I looked away from the painting, I could feel Adrian Cole's presence, hovering just behind me, whispering in my ear, urging me on. "Fix it," the voice murmured again, this time louder, more insistent. "Fix me." I could hear the desperation in his voice now. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a plea, a cry for help. But I realized, in the depths of my growing horror, that this was no longer about restoring a piece of art. This was about something far darker. Adrian Cole's soul was trapped, and I had been chosen, no, forced, to take his place. As the last strokes of paint blended into the canvas, the image before me became unmistakable. The figure of Adrian Cole was now complete, staring at me with hollow eyes, his expression a mixture of rage and sorrow. And in those eyes, I saw something that I couldn't ignore, something that sent a shiver down my spine. He was no longer trying to make peace. He was pulling me in. I stumbled back from the canvas, gasping for air, but the painting held me captive. The eyes of Adrian Cole seemed to grow larger, more intense, and then they moved. The reflection in the glass of the mirror warped again, the figure of the artist now standing, his body shuddering as though waking from a long sleep. In the mirror, his hands reached out toward me, and suddenly, I could feel the weight of his presence, his cold fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I whipped around, desperate to break free of the painting's grip, but when I turned to look at the mirror, I saw something far worse. The reflection had changed. It was no longer me standing there. It was him. Adrian Cole. And then, in the silence, I heard the final words. "Fix it, or you'll never leave." The room spun as a cold, suffocating darkness filled the air, pressing down on me from every direction. The mirror, The painting, they weren't just windows into another world. They were gateways. And I had just opened one. A scream rose in my throat, but it was swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. It was too late to turn back now. The curse had already taken root. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, locked in place. Adrian Cole's eyes, filled with rage and a strange satisfaction, stared back at me from every reflective surface, his form growing stronger as the shadows around me thickened. I was trapped. And then, as if in slow motion, I watched as the figure in the mirror, Adrian Cole, stepped out from the glass. The room seemed to bend, the walls warping, and with one final, agonizing breath, I realized that the fate I had feared was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. I could no longer tell where the darkness ended and the room began. The boundaries between the physical world and whatever nightmare I had unleashed were no longer clear. The air was thick with cold, suffocating pressure, and the walls seemed to warp, bending like soft clay under an invisible hand. The mirror no longer reflected me, but the twisted, contorted figure of Adrian Cole, his face stretched into an expression of cruel triumph. He stepped from the glass with a slow, deliberate movement, his gaunt, pale hands reaching out toward me, his eyes locked onto mine with a gaze that pierced straight to my soul. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, my body as though it were rooted to the spot. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was already dead, if this was some cruel purgatory. I wanted to scream, to run, but all that escaped was a ragged breath. "You can't escape," Adrian's voice rasped, the words coming from every direction, surrounding me. "You've already begun the work. Now you must finish it." The room darkened even further, the shadows twisting and writhing as if alive, pulling at my consciousness. My eyes darted to the painting, and I could see the face of Adrian Cole staring back at me, the eyes now filled with the same emptiness that was in his reflection, but also a deep, unyielding need. His lips parted, as if to speak, but the words came from everywhere. "Finish what I started." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and instinctively, I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, fingers itching toward the unfinished painting, as though compelled by some dark force. Every part of me screamed not to touch it, but it was as if my body no longer belonged to me. My hands reached for the brush, trembling as I dipped it into the paint. No. I fought against it, tried to pull away, but the force was too strong. My fingers clenched around the brush as if it were the only thing anchoring me to this reality. With a trembling hand, I dragged the brush across the canvas, completing the final strokes. The moment the brush touched the last part of the painting, a deep, guttural sound reverberated through the room, a sound that seemed to come from the very fabric of existence itself. The painting shimmered, its surface alive, as if the very act of finishing it had broken the last chain that held Adrian Cole's spirit trapped. The room shook violently. The walls seemed to cave in on themselves, and I could feel the temperature drop further, until it was freezing. My breath came out in sharp, panicked gasps, but through it all, I could hear Adrian's voice, closer now, almost a whisper in my ear. "Thank you. Now, it's your turn." I turned toward the mirror, my heart racing, and there, in its reflection, I saw not my own face, but Adrian's. His hollow eyes stared back at me, his expression no longer twisted in pain or anger, but calm, almost serene. The face of a man who had finally been freed. His lips parted once more, and this time I heard his final words clearly, as if spoken from the deepest pit of the earth. "You will be my last." And then the world went dark. The silence that followed was suffocating. For what felt like an eternity, I floated in the void, unable to grasp anything, unable to move or think. Then, slowly, the dark fog began to lift. I found myself back in the workshop, but it was different now. The paintings on the walls were gone, replaced by strange, unfinished canvases filled with images I didn't recognize. The workbench, once cluttered with tools and broken objects, now stood empty. The mirror, too, was gone. In its place, there was only an eerie stillness, as if the space had never existed. I tried to speak, but no words came. I tried to move, but my body felt foreign, as though I were disconnected from it. I reached out, but the air around me seemed to shudder, as if recoiling from my touch. Then, as I looked around in confusion, I saw it, the unfinished painting, now complete, hanging on the wall in front of me. The face of Adrian Colt stared back at me, his hollow eyes filled with an unsettling calm. And in the reflection, I could see my own face, twisted in terror and realization. I had become part of the work. The curse had taken its toll. Adrian Colt's spirit had been freed, but at the cost of my own. I was now a part of his creation, a piece of art that could never be restored. I stood there, trapped in the painting, unable to move, unable to speak. My last thought was of the journal I had found, the one that warned of the restorer's curse. It had been true. The work was never meant to be finished. And now, neither was I.